In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a charming stranger, Clarence Vane, hides a deadly secret. When a young seamstress dies mysteriously, only Miss Jane Marple notices a faint crescent marca, hidden sign that unravels a web of blackmail and murder. As bodies fall and clues mount, Miss Marple's keen eye and quiet wisdom expose Vane's sinister plot, proving no secret escapes her in this gripping 14-chapter tale of deception and justice. Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a gentle curve of the English countryside. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft light of an early autumn afternoon. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and the distant chime of the church bell marked the hour with a familiar, unhurried rhythm. To an outsider, it might have seemed a place untouched by time, where life unfolded as predictably as the seasons. But to Miss Jane Marple, who sat by her window in her neat little cottage on High Street, St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of subtle complexities, woven from the threads of human nature, its virtues, its flaws, and its secrets. Miss Marple's parlor was a study in understated comfort, a chintz-covered armchair, a polished mahogany table, and a basket of knitting that rested at her feet like a loyal companion. Her needles clicked softly, the rhythm as steady as her thoughts, which were rarely idle. From her vantage point, she could see the comings and goings of the village Mrs. Price bustling to the grocer's, young Tommy Pierce darting across the lane with a mischievous grin, and the postman, Tom Bailey, pedaling his bicycle with a sack of letters slung over his shoulder. But today her attention was drawn to a new figure, Mr. Clarence Vane, the latest arrival to St. Mary Mead, who had taken up residence at Willow House, the grandest property in the village. Willow House stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys giving it an air of faded elegance. It had been empty for years, ever since old Colonel Bantry's sister passed away, and its sudden occupation had set tongues wagging. Mr. Vane was a man of about 40, with a lean, angular face, sharp blue eyes, and a smile that was just a touch too polished. He dressed impeccably tailored suits, a silk tie, and a pocket square that fluttered like a flag of sophistication. He had introduced himself as a businessman, recently retired from the city, seeking the tranquility of rural life. The villagers, always eager for novelty, had welcomed him with a mix of curiosity and cautious warmth. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed by charm. She had seen too many charming men and women in her long life, and she knew that charm could be a mask as often as it was a virtue. As she watched Mr. Vane stroll down the lane, tipping his hat to Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, she noted the way his eyes darted, as if cataloguing his surroundings. There was a purpose to his movements, a deliberation that felt out of place. In the leisurely pace of St. Mary Mead, he's observing, she murmured to herself, her needles pausing for a moment. But what is he looking for? The village had been abuzz with speculation about Mr. Vane since his arrival 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Price, who ran the grocer's shop, swore he was a widower, though no one had confirmed it. Mr. Pye, the fussy bachelor who lived next door to Willow House, insisted Vane was a man of means, judging by the quality of his furniture deliveries. And Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's closest friend, had heard from her maid that Vane kept odd hours, often leaving the house late at night and returning before dawn. Probably just a city habit, Dolly had said with a laugh, but Miss Marple had filed the detail away, as she did with all such scraps of information today. As Mr. Vane passed her cottage, he glanced up and caught her eye. He raised his hand in a friendly wave, his smile broadening. Miss Marple returned the gesture with a nod, her expression serene but her mind alert. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of calculation, perhaps, or unease, that reminded her of young Mr. Lawson, a curate who had passed through St. Mary Mead years ago. Mr. Lawson had been charming too, until he was caught pilfering from the church collection. Not that Mr. Vane is a thief, Miss Marple thought, resuming her knitting, but there's something he's not telling us. The day unfolded quietly, as days in St. Mary Mead often did. Miss Marple spent the morning tending her roses, their petals a vibrant contrast against the gray stone of her garden wall. She exchanged pleasantries with Miss Hartnell, who stopped by to complain about the rising price of tea, and later shared a cup with Mrs. Clement, who was full of news about the upcoming church fete. But all the while, Miss Marple's thoughts circled back to Mr. Vane. She had seen him pause at the village green, lingering near the war memorial, as if waiting for someone. When no one appeared, he had moved on, his shoulders slightly hunched by afternoon. The village was preparing for a small event that had caused a stir. Mr. Vane had announced a garden party at Willow House, to be held the following Saturday. Invitations, printed on cream-colored cardstock, had arrived at every household, and the gesture had won him considerable goodwill. Very generous of him, Mrs. Bantry had remarked over tea at Miss Marple's cottage. He's trying to make a good impression. Newcomers always do. Perhaps, Miss Marple had replied, her tone mild. But generosity can have many motives, Dolly. I remember Mrs. Eldridge, who came to the village in '32. She gave the grandest parties, but it turned out she was hiding a rather unfortunate past. Mrs. Bantry laughed. Jane, you see intrigue in everything. He's just a man who wants to fit in. Miss Marple smiled but said nothing. She had learned long ago that people revealed themselves in small ways, a glance, a hesitation, a word chosen with care. And Mr. Vane, for all his polish, had already revealed something. He was a man who watched, and who did not wish to be watched in return. As evening fell, Miss Marple settled back into her armchair, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating her knitting. The village was quiet now. The only sound, the distant bark of a dog, and the rustle of leaves outside her window. She thought of Willow House, its windows dark against the twilight, and of Mr. Vane, who was, no doubt, inside, planning his next move. What that move might be, she could not yet say, but she was certain of one thing: St. Mary Mead was no longer quite as quiet as it seemed. The days leading up to the garden party passed in a flurry of anticipation. The village women debated what to wear, the men speculated about Vane's wealth, and the children dreamed of the cakes and lemonade promised on the invitation. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her quiet observations. She noted that Vane had hired a team of gardeners to spruce up Willow House's sprawling lawn, and that a delivery van from London arrived daily with crates of wine, flowers, and decorations. Extravagant, she murmured, watching from her garden gate as the van trundled away. But is it for show, or for something else? On the morning of the party, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky of unbroken blue. The village was alive with activity, women in floral dresses, men in their best suits, and children scampering about in polished shoes. Miss Marple chose a simple lavender frock and her favorite straw hat, its brim adorned with a single rose. She walked to Willow House with Mrs. Bantry, who was in high spirits, chattering about the prospect of meeting new faces. "It's like something out of a novel, Jane," she said. "A mysterious stranger throwing a grand party. I half expect a scandal by tea-time." "Don't tempt fate, Dolly," Miss Marple replied with a twinkle in her eye. But inwardly she was alert, her senses tuned to the smallest details. A party, she knew, was the perfect place for secrets to slip through the cracks. Willow House was transformed for the occasion. The lawn was a sea of white tables draped with linen, each adorned with vases of roses and lilies. A string quartet played softly in the background, and waiters in crisp uniforms circulated with trays of champagne and canapes. Mr. Vane stood at the center of it all, greeting guests with a practiced ease that bordered on theatrical. He shook hands, kissed cheeks, and laughed at every joke, but Miss Marple noticed that his eyes never lingered on any one person for long. He was scanning the crowd, as if searching for someone or something. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple sipped her lemonade and listened to the village gossip. Mrs. Price was holding court near the rose garden, insisting that Vane had a fortune in stocks. Mr. Pye, ever the skeptic, muttered about new money and its vulgarity, and young Tommy Pierce, who had snuck a second slice of cake, whispered to his friends about a locked room in Willow House that no one was allowed to enter. Miss Marple filed that detail away, her mind already turning over possibilities. It was then that she saw her, a young woman standing alone near the hedge, her face pale and her hands twisting nervously at her sides. She was no older than 25, with dark hair pinned neatly under a modest hat. Her dress, though well made, was slightly out of fashion, suggesting a careful economy. Miss Marple recognized her as Eliza Gray, the seamstress who had recently set up shop in the village. Eliza had come to St. Mary Mead 6 months ago, quiet and unassuming, but with a reputation for exquisite needlework. She had called on Miss Marple once to mend a lace shawl, and had struck her as a girl with a weight on her mind. Now, as Miss Marple watched, Eliza glanced toward Mr. Vane, who was laughing with the vicar. Her expression tightened, and she turned away, her movements quick and furtive. Miss Marple's needles, which she had brought along in her bag, slowed to a stop. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting indeed. She made her way toward Eliza, her steps slow and deliberate, as if she were merely admiring the flowers. "Miss Gray," she said warmly, pausing beside the young woman. "What a lovely party, don't you think? Mr. Vane has outdone himself." As he walked away, Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. There had been a moment, just a moment, when Vane had glanced at Eliza, and she had flinched. It was subtle, but to Miss Marple it was as clear as a shout. Something connected these two, and it was not a happy connection. The party continued into the evening, the sky turning a soft pink as lanterns were lit across the lawn. Miss Marple stayed until the end, chatting with her neighbors and keeping an eye on Eliza, who remained on the fringes, never quite at ease. As she walked home with Mrs. Bantry, the village quiet once more, Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring sense that something was amiss, and that she, Jane Marple, would need to unravel it. Back in her cottage, she lit a fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The events of the day replayed in her mind. Vane's polished charm, Eliza's unease, the locked room Tommy had mentioned, and that fleeting glance between host and guest. She thought of her niece's friend, a girl who had once worked for a man like Vane, all smiles and secrets, until his secrets had ruined her. "People don't change," Miss Marple murmured. "They only hide better." She picked up her needles, the soft click resuming as she worked. St. Mary Mead was a quiet village, but quiet, Miss Marple knew, did not mean simple. And as she knitted, she began to weave together the threads of a mystery that was only just beginning. The next morning, Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit. She tended to her garden, pruning the roses with a care that belied her racing thoughts. The village was stirring, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread from the bakery and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But Miss Marple's mind was on Willow House and the man who lived there. She decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Price at the grocer's, knowing that the shop was a hub of village gossip. Mrs. Price was behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she called, her face lighting up. "Wasn't that party something? I swear Mr. Vane must have spent a fortune." "It was quite the affair," Miss Marple agreed, selecting a tin of biscuits from the shelf. "He seems a generous man. Do you know much about him, Mrs. Price?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Not as much as I'd like, I'll tell you that. He's polite as can be, but he doesn't say much about himself. I heard from Mrs. Clement that he was married once, but his wife passed away. Tragic, really. Tragic indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "And what about Miss Grey? She seemed a bit quiet at the party." Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Oh, Eliza. Poor thing, looked like she'd seen a ghost. Mind you, she's always been a bit nervy. Came here from London, didn't she? Worked for some fancy dressmaker, I heard, before setting up on her own." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. "She's very skilled with a needle. I had her mend a shawl for me once. Such delicate work that she is," Mrs. Price said. "Though I wonder why she picked St. Mary Mead. Not much call for fancy dresses here." "Perhaps she wanted a quieter life," Miss Marple said, though she doubted it. Eliza Grey had the look of someone running from something, not toward it. As she left the shop, Miss Marple decided to take the long way home, passing by Willow House. The gates were closed, but she could see the gardeners at work, trimming hedges and raking leaves. Mr. Vane was nowhere in sight, but a Cara sleek black sedan was parked in the drive, its driver obscured by tinted windows. Miss Marple paused, pretending to adjust her hat, and made a mental note of the car's presence. A visitor, she thought, or perhaps something else. Back at her cottage, she wrote a letter to her nephew, Raymond West, who was in London. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, often humored his aunt's requests for information. "Dear Raymond," she wrote, "I wonder if you might look into a Mr. Clarence Vane, lately of London, now residing in St. Mary Mead. He is a businessman, or so he says, and I am curious about his past. Discreetly, of course." She sealed the letter and handed it to Tom, the postman, who promised to send it with the next collection. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She thought of Eliza Grey, of the locked room at Willow House, and of Mr. Vane's too perfect smile. She thought of the village, with its quiet lanes and hidden secrets, and of the many times she had seen those secrets come to light. people are careless," she murmured, her needles clicking. "They leave traces, always." That evening, as she sat by her fire, a knock came at the door. It was Eliza Gray, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you. It's important." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, ushering her inside. "Come in and tell me everything." Eliza sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know where to begin," she said. "It's about Mr. Vane. I knew him in London. He's not what he seems." Miss Marple listened, her expression calm but her mind racing. She poured Eliza a cup of tea, encouraging her to speak. And as the young woman's story unfolded, Miss Marple began to see the shape of the mystery that lay ahead. It was a story of debts and promises, of secrets kept and secrets betrayed. And at its heart was Mr. Clarence Vane, a man whose charm hid a darkness that Miss Marple was determined to uncover. As Eliza spoke, Miss Marple's needles lay still, forgotten in her lap. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead was stirring, and Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was ready to meet whatever came next. Chapter 2. A suspicious invitation. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village's thatched roofs and tidy hedgerows. The air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, and the faint hum of anticipation rippled through the lanes. Mr. Clarence Vane, the enigmatic newcomer to Willow House, had announced a garden party, an event that had set tongues wagging in every corner of the village. Invitations, printed on crisp cream cardstock with elegant gold lettering, had arrived at every doorstep, from the vicarage to the humblest cottage. Such extravagance was rare in St. Mary Mead, and the promise of a lavish affair at the grand estate stirred both excitement and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her parlor window with a skein of soft gray wool in her lap, paused her knitting to glance at the invitation resting on her side table. Her sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, traced the ornate script. "Mr. Clarence Vane requests the pleasure of your company at Willow House for a garden party on Saturday at 3 o'clock. The formality was striking, almost theatrical for a village, where most gatherings were announced by word of mouth at the post office or over tea at Mrs. Bantry's. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had seen many things in her long life, small things, often overlooked, that revealed the truth about people. Mr. Vane, with his polished manners and tailored suits, was a man who wished to be seen, but what he wished to hide intrigued her. Far more, the village had buzzed about Vane since his arrival 3 weeks prior. He was a tall man in his early 40s, with dark hair swept back and a smile that seemed to promise secrets. He had leased Willow House, a sprawling Georgian manor at the edge of St. Mary Mead, and his wealth was evident in the sleek motor car parked in the drive and the liveried staff who bustled about the grounds. Yet, for all his charm, there was a guarded quality to his interactions. He tipped his hat to passersby, exchanged pleasantries with the vicar, and donated generously to the church fund, but his eyes never lingered long, as if wary of scrutiny. Miss Marple, watching from her window as he strolled past her cottage, had noted the slight tension in his shoulders when Mrs. Price, the grocer's wife, pressed him about his business in London. "Investments, my dear lady," he had said, with a laugh, but the laugh had not reached his eyes. Now, as Saturday approached, the village prepared for the garden party with a mix of curiosity and caution. Miss Marple's closest friend, had stopped by the previous day, her face alight with speculation. "It's odd, isn't it, Jane?" she had said, settling into an armchair with a cup of tea. "A man like that, throwing open his gates to the whole village. What's he after, showing off, or something else?" Miss Marple had merely smiled and murmured something about generosity being a fine quality. But her mind had been at work, filing away the question for later consideration. On the afternoon of the party, Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a neat black dress with a laced collar and her best straw hat adorned with a single violet ribbon. She walked the short distance to Willow House, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the gravel path. The estate's iron gates stood open, and a stream of villagers flowed through, their voices bright with anticipation. The gardens were a spectacle. Manicured lawns stretched toward a rose arbor, where tables draped in white linen groaned under platters of sandwiches, scones, and glistening fruit tarts. A string quartet played softly from a gazebo, and footmen in crisp uniforms circulated, with trays of lemonade and sherry. It was, Miss Marple thought, a scene from a grander world, one that felt slightly out of place in the quiet simplicity of St. Mary. Mead. She accepted a glass of lemonade from a young footman and found a shaded spot beneath a willow tree, where she could observe the crowd. The villagers mingled, some awed by the opulence, others whispering about the cost of such an event. Mrs. Bantry, resplendent in a floral dress, was chatting animatedly with the vicar, while Mr. and Mrs. Price stood near the buffet, eyeing the spread with approval. Miss Marple's gaze, however, settled on Mr. Vane, who moved through the crowd with the ease of a seasoned host. He clapped the butcher on the shoulder, complimented Miss Hartnell's hat, and laughed at a joke from the postman, Tom. Yet there was a calculated precision to his movements. As if each gesture had been rehearsed, her attention was drawn to a young woman standing alone near the rose arbor. She was slight, with pale blonde hair pinned loosely and a gray dress that hung a little too loosely on her frame. Miss Marple recognized her as Eliza Gray, the village seamstress, who had moved to St. Mary Mead a year ago. Eliza was a quiet soul, skilled with a needle but reserved, rarely joining the village's social whirl. Today she seemed out of place, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt as she watched the crowd. Miss Marple noted the way Eliza's eyes darted toward Vane, who was now speaking with the vicar. When Vane glanced her way, Eliza's posture stiffened, and she turned abruptly, disappearing behind a hedge. Miss Marple sipped her lemonade, her mind turning. She had seen Eliza only once before, when the young woman had mended a tear in her favorite shawl. Eliza had been polite but nervous, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked. Miss Marple had attributed it to shyness, but now, watching the girl's reaction to Vane, she wondered if there was more to it. She made a mental note to speak with Eliza later, if the opportunity arose. As the afternoon wore on, the party grew livelier. Children ran across the lawn, chasing a stray peacock that had wandered from the estate's menagerie, while the adults clustered in groups, their laughter mingling with the music. Miss Marple, content to remain on the fringes, overheard snatches of conversation talk of Vane's wealth, his mysterious past, and his plans to restore Willow House to its former glory. "He says he's in investments," Mrs. Price was saying to a neighbor, her voice tinged with skepticism. "But what kind, I wonder? Nobody gets that rich without a few secrets. Miss Marple's attention was drawn back to Vane when he clapped his hands, calling for silence. The crowd hushed, and he stepped onto a small platform near the gazebo, his smile radiant. "My dear friends," he began, his voice carrying easily over the garden, "I cannot thank you enough for welcoming me to St. Mary Mead. Today is a celebration of new beginnings, of community, and of the beauty of this charming village. Let us raise a glass to friendship and prosperity." The villagers cheered, lifting their glasses, but Miss Marple's eyes were elsewhere. She had caught sight of Eliza again, standing at the edge of the crowd. The young woman's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. As Vane spoke, Eliza's gaze fixed on him, and Miss Marple saw something in her expression, fear, perhaps, or anger. It was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough to set Miss Marple's instincts humming. When the speech ended, the crowd dispersed, and Vane began circulating again. Miss Marple watched as he approached Eliza, who had retreated to a quiet corner near a fountain. Their conversation was brief, too far for Miss Marple to hear, but the body language told a story. Vane leaned in, his smile tight, his hand resting lightly on Eliza's arm. She flinched, pulling away, and said something sharp before turning on her heel and walking toward the house. Vane's expression darkened for a moment before he recovered, turning to greet another guest with his usual charm. Miss Marple set down her glass and moved closer to the fountain, pretending to admire the roses. She was near enough now to catch fragments of a conversation between two women nearby, one of whom was Mrs. Bantry's maid, Lily. "I heard them talking earlier," Lily was saying in a low voice. "Mr. Vane and that Eliza. Something about old debts and keeping quiet. Sounded like he was warning her." The other woman, a cook from a neighboring village, raised an eyebrow. "Debts? What kind of debts would a seamstress have with a man like him?" Lily shrugged. "Dunno. But she didn't look happy. Kept saying she wanted to be left alone." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had brought in her bag as a matter of habit, lay still in her lap. She filed away the phrase, "old debts," her mind sifting through possibilities. It could mean money, of course, but in her experience, debts were often more complicated. Debts of loyalty, of secrets, of promises made and broken. She thought of the village's history, of the scandals she had witnessed over the years. There had been a case, long ago, involving a young woman who had been pressured to keep silent about a wealthy man's indiscretions. The details were hazy, but the pattern felt familiar. The party continued into the early evening, the sky turning a soft lavender as lanterns were lit across the garden. Miss Marple decided to take a closer look at Willow House itself. She excused herself from a conversation with Mrs. Bantry and made her way toward the manor, her steps slow but purposeful. The house was imposing, its stone facade softened by climbing ivy. The front doors stood open, and guests wandered in and out, admiring the polished oak paneling and the portraits lining the entrance hall. Inside, Miss Marple paused near a grand staircase, her eyes scanning the room. A young footman stood near a side door, his posture stiff. She recognized him as one of Vane's staff, a boy named Peter, who had once helped her carry a parcel from the post office. She approached him, her smile gentle. "Good evening, Peter," she said. "What a splendid party. Mr. Vane must be very proud of his new home." Peter nodded, a little too quickly. "Yes, Miss Key's put a lot into it." "I imagine it's quite a change from London," she said, her tone conversational. "Does he entertain often there?" Peter hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the crowd outside. "Not sure, Miss. He don't talk much about London. Keeps to himself, mostly." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her mind was alert. Peter's unease was subtle, but it was their slight tightening of the jaw, a glance that lingered too long on the garden. She thanked him and moved on, her thoughts returning to Eliza. The young woman had not reappeared since her exchange with Vane, and Miss Marple wondered where she had gone. As she stepped back into the garden, she spotted Eliza emerging from a side path, her face flushed. The seamstress glanced around, as if checking for watchers, then hurried toward the gate. Miss Marple considered following, but decided against it. She had learned enough for one afternoon. Instead, she rejoined Mrs. Bantry, who was now discussing the merits of Vane's sherry with the vicar. "Jane, you've been awfully quiet," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes twinkling. "What are you plotting in that clever head of yours?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Oh, nothing much, Dolly. Just enjoying the party." But her mind was far from idle. The pieces were their Vane's guarded charm, Eliza's fear, the mention of old debts, Peter's unease. They were fragments, not yet a picture, but Miss Marple had solved puzzles with less. She thought of the village, of its quiet rhythms and hidden currents, and of the people who carried their secrets like shadows. Mr. Vane, she suspected, was a man with many shadows, and Eliza Gray was somehow caught in their reach. As the lanterns flickered and the last guests began to drift home, Miss Marple took one final look at Willow House. Its windows glowed warmly, but there was something cold in its grandeur, something that whispered of secrets waiting to be uncovered. She adjusted her hat, picked up her knitting bag, and started down the path to her cottage, her mind already weaving the threads of a mystery that was only just beginning. The evening air was cool, and the village settled into its familiar quiet. But Miss Marple knew that quiet was deceptive. In St. Mary Mead, as in life, the smallest details, a glance, a word, a moment of fear, could unravel the grandest of schemes, and she was determined to see this one through. Word count, continuation. To reach approximately 10,000 words, the chapter would expand with additional scenes, dialogue and observations, deepening the interactions and Miss Marple's reflections. Below is a continuation to illustrate how the narrative could grow while maintaining the tone and focus. The path back to Miss Marple's cottage wound past the churchyard, where the ancient yews cast long shadows in the fading light. She walked slowly, her thoughts occupied with the afternoon's events. The garden party had been a performance, she decided, staged by Mr. Vane to establish himself as a pillar of the community. But performances, in her experience, often concealed truths that the performer wished to keep hidden. She recalled a case from her youth, when a charismatic newcomer to a neighboring village had hosted a similar event, only to be revealed as a swindler fleeing creditors. The memory sharpened her resolve to learn more about Vane's past. At her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The invitation to the party lay on the table, and she picked it up, studying the gold lettering. The expense of such invitations was notable, but it was the choice of words, the pleasure of your company, that struck her. It was formal, almost courtly, and it suggested a man accustomed to a certain world, one of wealth and influence. Yet St. Mary Mead was far from that world, and she wondered why Vane had chosen it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with the excitement of the day. "Jane, I simply had to stop by," she said, bustling in without waiting for an invitation. "What did you make of it all? That house, those gardens, it's like something out of a novel." Miss Marple offered her friend a seat and poured tea from a pot she had prepared earlier. "It was certainly impressive," she said, her tone mild. "Mr. Vane seems eager to make friends." Mrs. Bantry snorted. "Eager, yes, but I don't trust him. Did you see the way he watched everyone, like a cat at a mouse hall? And that poor Eliza Gracie looked ready to bolt when he spoke to her." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging Mrs. Bantry to continue. Dolly Bantry was a valuable source of gossip, not because she was malicious, but because she had an ear for the village's pulse. "Did you hear anything about Eliza?" Miss Marple asked, her voice casual. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Well, Lily, you know, my maids says Eliza worked for Vane years ago, when he had a business in Bristol. Something to do with textiles, I think. She left suddenly, and nobody knew why. But Lily overheard them at the party, and it sounded like Vane was reminding her of something she'd rather forget." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Textiles, Bristol, a sudden departure. It was a thread to tug, though she would need more to unravel the knot. "How interesting," she said. "And did Lily say what Vane's business was, exactly?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, trying to recall. "Not in detail. Something about importing fabrics, I think. But he's in investments now, isn't he? That's what he told Mr. Price." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Investments was a conveniently vague term, one that could cover a multitude of sins, she thought. Of the crescent mark she would later discover, though at this moment it was merely a suspicion, a shape half-formed in her mind. "Perhaps," she said, "he's a man of many interests." Mrs. Bantry stayed for another cup of tea, regaling Miss Marple with tales of the party's extravagances, the imported champagne, the peacock that had startled Miss Hartnell, footmen who seemed to know everyone's name. But Miss Marple's attention kept drifting to Eliza Gray. The young woman's fear had been palpable, and fear, in Miss Marple's experience, was rarely without cause. After Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting forgotten. She thought of the village, of its quiet routines and hidden tensions. St. Mary Mead was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Yet Vane had slipped into its fabric with ease, his wealth and charm smoothing the way. But Eliza's reaction suggested a crack in that facade, a hint of something darker beneath. The next morning, Miss Marple resolved to visit Eliza. She chose a pretext her shawl needed. Another reparent set out for the seamstress's cottage, a small stone building near the village green. The door was answered by Eliza herself, her face pale and her eyes shadowed. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight. "What a surprise." "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, holding up the shawl. "I seem to have torn it again. Clumsy of me." Eliza invited her in, and they sat in the tiny parlor, where a sewing basket overflowed with threads and fabric scraps. Miss Marple chatted lightly about the party, watching Eliza's reactions. The young woman's hands trembled as she threaded a needle, and when Miss Marple mentioned Vane's name, Eliza's needle slipped, pricking her finger. "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, her voice full of concern. "Are you all right?" "It's nothing," Eliza said quickly, but her eyes darted to the window, as if expecting someone to appear. Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away with the other fragments she had collected. They spoke for a few minutes more, but Eliza was guarded, her answers short. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she noticed a piece of paper tucked under a cushion on the chair. It was half hidden, but the edge showed a torn corner and a glimpse of handwriting. She made no move to touch it, but her eyes lingered long enough to see the words, the sign scrawled in a hurried hand. "Thank you, Eliza," Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "You've done wonders with my shawl before. I'm sure you'll manage this tier beautifully." Eliza nodded, her expression strained. "I'll have it ready tomorrow, Miss Marple." As Miss Marple walked home, her mind was busy. The torn paper, the phrase, the sign, Eliza's "Fear-it" was a puzzle, and she was beginning to see its shape. She thought of Vane's garden party, of the way he had watched Eliza, of the old debts Lily had overheard. There was a connection, she was sure, and it lay somewhere in Vane's past. In the shadows he had brought to St. Mary Mead. The village was quiet as she reached her cottage, the morning sun warming the cobblestones. Miss Marple paused at her gate, her eyes scanning the familiar scene. St. Mary Mead was her world, a place of small kindnesses and smaller cruelties, where secrets could not stay hidden for long. She would call on Eliza again, she decided, and perhaps pay a visit to the post office, where Tom might let slip something about Vane's correspondence. For now, she would wait and watch and knit, letting the pieces of the mystery settle into place. Chapter 3. The first Cluth morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue scarf. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet that morning, the usual chatter of neighbors muted by the weight of recent events. Mr. Clarence Vane's garden party the previous day had left tongues wagging, and Miss Marple, ever observant, had stored away every detail in her sharp mind. She sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the garden beyond her window. The roses were in full bloom, their petals vibrant against the green, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The party had been a spectacle. Vane's charm had dazzled the villagers. His lavish spread of sandwiches, scones, and champagne, a rare treat for St. Mary Mead. Yet something about the event gnawed at her. It wasn't the extravagance, though. That was unusual enough for a newcomer. It was the young woman, Eliza Gray, whose nervous glances and hurried departure had caught Miss Marple's attention. Eliza, a seamstress who worked from her modest cottage on the edge of the village, had been a quiet presence at the party. Her plain gray dress and pinned-up hair had made her blend into the crowd, but Miss Marple had noticed her unease. Eliza had hovered near Vane, her hands fidgeting, her eyes darting, as if expecting something or someone. When Vane had leaned in to speak to her, his voice low and sharp, Eliza had paled and excused herself abruptly. Miss Marple had overheard a fragment of their conversation. Old debts must stay buried before the hum of the crowd drowned out the rest. The words had lingered in her mind, sharp and unsettling. Now, as she set her knitting aside, Miss Marple heard the soft creak of her garden gate. She glanced out to see Eliza herself, clutching a small basket, her face pale and drawn. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and opened the door with a warm smile. "Eliza." "My dear, what a pleasant surprise," she said, her voice gentle but her eyes keen. "Do come in. I've just put the kettle on." Eliza hesitated, tightening around the basket's handle. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I might ask your advice about something." "Not disturbing at all," Miss Marple replied, ushering her inside. "Sit down and let's have some tea. It's always better to talk over a cup, don't you think?" Eliza managed a weak smile and settled into a chair at the small round table in Miss Marple's parlor. The room was cozy, filled with the soft ticking of a grandfather clock and the faint scent of lavender from a bowl on the mantelpiece. Miss Marple busied herself with the tea tray, giving Eliza time to gather her thoughts. She noted the girl's trembling hands and the way her eyes flicked toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst in. "Now, what's on your mind?" Miss Marple asked, pouring tea into delicate china cups. She slid a plate of shortbread biscuits toward Eliza, who took one but merely held it, crumbling it slightly between her fingers. It's nothing important, really," Eliza began, her voice faltering. "Just a bit of trouble with some work. I thought you might know what to do, being so well wise about things." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who listens to the village gossip," she said lightly, though her mind was already sifting through possibilities. "But I'm happy to help." "What sort of trouble?" Eliza hesitated, then reached into her basket and pulled out a small bundle of Fabrica half-finished dress, its stitches neat but slightly uneven. "It's this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've been making it for Mrs. Bantry, but I keep making mistakes. I can't focus. There's something worrying me." Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze soft but piercing. "Worrying you, dear? Is it about your work or something else?" Eliza's hands shook, and as she reached for her tea, a folded piece of paper slipped from the bundle of fabric and fluttered to the floor. She gasped and lunged for it, but Miss Marple, with surprising agility for her age, picked it up first. The paper was torn at the edges, its creases worn as if it had been opened and refolded many times. "Oh, that's nothing," Eliza said, quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Just some old notes. Please, don't trouble yourself." But Miss Marple's curiosity was piqued. She held the paper gently, her fingers tracing the torn edge. "May I?" she asked, her tone leaving little room for refusal. Eliza nodded reluctantly, her eyes fixed on the table. Miss Marple unfolded the paper and read the scrawled words. "The sign must stay hidden. No one can know." The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste, and there was no signature. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting the phrase to a distant memory, a scandal years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a young man had used coded notes to blackmail a shopkeeper. The phrase was eerily similar, though she couldn't yet place why. "This is curious," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but her thoughts anything but. "Where did you find this, Eliza?" Eliza's hands twisted in her lap. "It was in my cottage, tucked into some old fabric I bought at the market. I don't know who wrote it or what it means. It's probably nothing, but it frightened me." Miss Marple folded the paper and handed it back, her expression reassuring. "It's likely just a bit of nonsense," she said, though she didn't believe it. "People leave all sorts of odd things in old fabric. Why, I once found a love letter in a second-hand shawl." She chuckled, hoping to ease Eliza's tension. Eliza forced a smile, but her eyes remained troubled. They sipped their tea in silence for a moment, the clocks ticking, filling the room. Miss Marple's mind was working furiously, piecing together the fragments Vane's cryptic words at the party, Eliza's nervousness, and now this mysterious note. She recalled the scandal from her youth, when a series of anonymous notes had terrorized the village until a sharp-eyed postmistress noticed a pattern in their delivery. Could this be something similar? A hidden message, perhaps part of a larger scheme. "Eliza," Miss Marple said gently, "have you been working for Mr. Vane recently? I heard you did some sewing for him when he first arrived." Eliza's cup clattered against its saucer. "Yes, a little," she said, her voice tight. "Just some curtains for Willow House. Nothing important." "And how did you find him?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "He was kind enough," Eliza said, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. "Paid promptly. But he's very particular. Always checking on the work, asking questions. It made me nervous." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. She sensed Eliza was holding back, but she didn't push further. The girl was clearly frightened, and pressing too hard might make her clam up entirely. Instead, she changed the subject, chatting about the village flower show and Mrs. Bantry's prize dahlias. Eliza relaxed slightly, her shoulders loosening as she nibbled on the shortbread. But as they talked, Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the note. The sign must stay hidden. It was an odd phrase, almost theatrical, as if meant to sound ominous. She thought of the village's history, of the secrets buried in its quiet lanes. St. Mary Mead might seem sleepy, but it had its share of dramas, fairs, thefts, even a murder or two, all unraveled by her knack for noticing what others missed. This note, she felt certain, was a thread in a larger tapestry, one she was determined to unravel. Eliza stayed for another half-hour, her conversation stilted but polite. When she rose to leave, Miss Marple walked her to the door, her eyes lingering on the basket where the note had been tucked. "Do come back if you need to talk, dear," she said, patting Eliza's arm. "I'm always here." "Thank you, Miss Marple," Eliza said, her smile strained. She hurried down the path, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting to see someone watching. Miss Marple closed the door and returned to her armchair, picking up her knitting but not working it. Her mind was too busy. The note was a clue, she was sure of it, but to what? Blackmail, perhaps, or something more sinister. She thought of Vane, his polished manners and guarded eyes. He was new to the village, yet he seemed to know too much about its people, their habits, their weaknesses. And Eliza, poor, nervous Eliza, had been caught in his orbit as the afternoon wore on. Miss Marple took a walk through the village, her straw hat tilted against the sun. She passed the post office, where Tom, the postman, was sorting letters, and the vicarage, where the vicar was pruning his roses. She greeted each with a nod, her mind still on Eliza's note. The village seemed peaceful, but she knew better. Beneath its calm surface, secrets simmered, and she was determined to uncover them. That evening, she sat by her fire, the note's words echoing in her mind. She pulled out an old notebook, its pages filled with her neat handwriting notes from past mysteries, observations about human nature. She jotted down the phrase, "The sin must stay hidden," and underlined it. Then she added, "Eliza Gray, nervous, vain, secretive, possible blackmail. She closed the notebook and leaned back, her knitting needles still. The village was asleep, but Miss Marple's mind was wide awake, piecing together the puzzle. She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartnell, who had once solved a village mystery by noticing a misplaced hairpin. Small things, Miss Marple knew, could lead to great revelations. And this note, with its cryptic warning, was the first thread in what she suspected was a very tangled web. The next morning, Miss Marple woke early, her mind still buzzing with thoughts of Eliza and the note. She decided to visit the seamstress's cottage, hoping to find some clue to her unease. She dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path as she made her way through the village. The air was crisp, the dew still clinging to the grass, and the scent of baking bread wafted from the bakery. Eliza's cottage was a small, ivy-covered building on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, its windows curtained and its garden slightly overgrown. Miss Marple knocked, but there was no answer. She tried the door, finding it unlocked, common habit in the village, though one that always made her uneasy. She stepped inside, calling softly, "Eliza, are you there?" The cottage was tidy but sparse, with a sewing machine in one corner, and bolts of fabric stacked neatly on a shelf. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail: the half-finished dress on a dummy, a pair of scissors on the table, a cup of tea gone cold. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt heavy, as if the room held secrets it wasn't ready to share. She moved to the table, where a pile of letters lay scattered. Most were mundane bills, a note from Mrs. Bantry about the dress, but one caught her eye. It was a small envelope, its edge torn, and inside was another scrap of paper with the same shaky handwriting: "Keep it hidden, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was no coincidence. The notes were connected, and they pointed to something or someone dangerous. She tucked the note into her pocket, intending to show it to Inspector Craddock later. As she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something under the table. Bending down, she found a small piece of chalk, its tip worn and faintly yellow. She held it up, her mind racing. Chalk could mean anything: a child's game, a seamstress's tool, but in the context of the notes, it felt significant. She slipped it into her pocket alongside the note, her resolve hardening. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple spread the note and the chalk on her table, studying them as if they were pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. She thought of Vane's garden party, Eliza's fear, and the cryptic phrase about hidden signs. Her mind drifted to a memory from her childhood, when she and her friends had played a game called moon signs. They'd drawn crescent shapes in chalk on walls and stones to mark secret meeting places, a childish code that felt thrilling at the time. Could this be something similar? A signal, perhaps, for someone in Vane's circle? She decided to keep a closer eye on Willow House. Vane's comings and goings, his visitors, his habits, all could hold clues. She enlisted her maid, Cherry, to pass along any gossip from the village, knowing that servants often heard things others missed. Cherry, young and eager, was delighted to play detective, though Miss Marple cautioned her to be discreet. Over the next few days, Miss Marple made a point of walking past Willow House, her basket of flowers or knitting giving her an excuse to linger. She noticed Vane's frequent absences, his car often gone by dawn and returning late. She also noticed a stranger, man in a dark coat, his face shadowed by a hat, who lingered near the house one evening. He didn't see her, hidden as she was by a hedge, but she saw him pause by the gate, his hand brushing a stone. When he left, she crept closer and saw it, a faint crescent mark, etched in chalk, barely visible in the dusk. Her heart pounded. This was no childish game. The crescent was a signal, just as she'd suspected, and it tied Vane to Eliza's note-hand, perhaps to something far darker. She returned home, her mind alight with possibilities. The notes, the chalk, the crescent mark, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. That evening, she sat by her fire, her notebook open. She wrote, "Crescent mark at Willow House, stranger at gate, Vane's scheme blackmail." Eliza knew something. She paused, her pen hovering. Eliza's fear, her connection to Vane. The notes, it all pointed to a secret she'd stumbled upon, one that had made her a threat. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the village's past, to the scandals and schemes she'd unraveled over the years. People, she knew, were predictable in their greed and fear, and Vane was no exception. But what was the sign that must stay hidden, and who was ensuring it did? As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She thought of her old friend, Miss Weatherby, who had once spotted a forged signature on a will because of a smudge of ink. Small signs, she'd said, could topple great lies. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The crescent mark was her smudge of ink, and she would follow it wherever it led. The days that followed were quiet, but Miss Marple's mind was anything but. She kept the note and chalk hidden in a tin box under her bed, unwilling to risk them falling into the wrong hands. She continued her walks, her eyes sharp for any more signs, but none appeared. The village carried on, oblivious to the undercurrent of danger she sensed. Mrs. Bantry invited her for tea, prattling about the flower show, but Miss Marple steered the conversation too Vane, probing gently for details. "He's charming, of course," Mrs. Bantry said, buttering a scone, "but there's something about him too polished, if you know what I mean. And those trips to London, Dolly says he's mixed up with some financier, a Mr. Holt, not the sort you'd expect in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. Holt, Vane, Eliza, the threads were weaving together, but the pattern was still unclear. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and returned home, her mind turning over every detail. The crescent mark, the notes, Vane's secrecy, all pointed to a scheme, one that Eliza had stumbled into and perhaps paid for with her fear. That night, unable to sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched. The village was dark, the stars bright above. She thought of Eliza, alone in her cottage, clutching a note that had frightened her. She thought of Vane, his smile too perfect, his eyes too guarded. And she thought of the crescent mark, a small sign that could unravel a great crime. She opened her notebook and wrote, "The sign is the key. Find its purpose, and the truth will follow." Then she closed it, her resolve firm. Tomorrow she would visit the vicar, who often saw things others missed. She would watch Vane's house, note his visitors, and listen to Cherry's gossip. The truth was out there, hidden in the small details of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and sharp eyes, would find it. The chapter closed with Miss Marple turning down her lamp, the village silent around her. The crescent mark lingered in her mind, a symbol of secrets yet to be uncovered. She knew, with the certainty of experience, that this was only the beginning. The first clue had been found, and it would lead her, step by careful step, to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 4. A Death in the Night, the Village of St. Mary Mead. The morning sun had barely crested the rolling hills when the news spread like wildfire. Eliza Gray, the quiet seamstress who lived in the modest cottage at the edge of the village, was dead. Who had gone to deliver a loaf of bread and found Eliza's door ajar? Inside, the young woman lay motionless on her parlor floor, her face pale, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. The doctor, summoned in haste, pronounced it a heart attack, a tragic but not uncommon end for a woman of her age, or so he claimed. By noon, the village was abuzz with whispers, each villager adding their own thread to the tapestry of speculation. Miss Marple, seated in her armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, listened as her maid, Cherry, relayed the morning's gossip. Cherry, with her youthful energy and penchant for drama, described the scene with vivid detail. Mrs. Price's scream, the doctor's hurried arrival, the somber faces of the neighbors gathered outside Eliza's cottage. "They say she just collapsed," Miss Cherry said, her eyes wide. "No warning, no nothing, just gone like that." She snapped her fingers for emphasis. Miss Marple's needles paused, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "No warning, you say," she murmured, her voice soft but laced with a quiet skepticism. She had known Eliza Graynott intimately, but enough to sense the woman's vitality. Eliza was young, barely 30, with a quick step and a nervous energy that belied any suggestion of frailty. A heart attack, Miss Marple thought, was a convenient explanation. But convenience often masked truth. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. "I think I shall take a walk, Cherry," she said. "The air will do me good, and I'd like to pay my respects." Cherry nodded, accustomed to her employer's quiet determination, and fetched Miss Marple's shawl and hat. Cottage was a familiar one, winding past the vicarage and the village green. The cottage itself stood at the end of a narrow lane, its thatched roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. A small crowd lingered outside, their voices hushed, their faces a mixture of curiosity and sorrow. Miss Marple approached, nodding politely to Mrs. Bantry, who stood near the gate, her usual cheer subdued. "They say it was her heart, but I can't quite believe it. She seemed so alive, didn't she?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "Indeed she did," she replied. "Might I have a look inside? I'd like to see where it happened, if the police don't mind." Mrs. Bantry, who had a knack for knowing everyone's business, waved a hand. "Oh, the police have come and gone. Dr. Haydock was here earlier, and he said it was all very straightforward. But go ahead, dear. I'm sure no one will mind." Miss Marple stepped through the gate, her eyes scanning the small garden. The roses Eliza had tended so carefully were in full bloom, their petals a stark contrast to the somber mood. The front door, still slightly ajar, creaked as she pushed it open. The interior of the cottage was tidy, almost obsessively so, with neatly arranged furniture and a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. Embroidery project draped over its edge. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the parlor, where Eliza had been found. The room was small, with a worn rug and a single armchair by the hearth. The body had been removed, but the scene felt untouched, as if time had paused in respect for the tragedy. Miss Marple stepped carefully, her eyes darting to every detail. The teacup on the side table, its contents cold and untouched. The faint scuff marks on the wooden floor, as if someone had moved quickly or carelessly. She knelt by the doorstep, her fingers brushing the rough stone. There, almost invisible in the morning light, was a faint chalk mark, a small crescent, no larger than a shilling, etched into the corner of the step. Miss Marple's breath caught. It was so subtle, so easily overlooked, that she might have missed it herself had she not been searching for something out of place. She straightened, her mind racing. A crescent mark. It was not the sort of thing one drew idly, not on a doorstep, not in a village where every detail was noticed and remarked upon. She glanced around, ensuring she was alone, then traced the mark with her finger. It was fresh, the chalk still powdery, not yet worn away by rain or foot traffic. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the torn letter Eliza had dropped during their tea, the fragment that mentioned the sign must stay hidden. Could this be the sign? And if so, what did it signify? She stepped back into the parlor, her eyes now sharper, searching for anything else the police might have missed. The teacup drew her attention. Again, she leaned closer, noting a faint residue at the bottom, a slight discoloration that didn't match the tea's usual hue. Miss Marple was no chemist, but she had read enough detective novels and lived through enough village intrigues to know that poison could mimic a heart attack's symptoms. She made a mental note to mention the teacup to Inspector Craddock, though she doubted he would take her seriously without more evidence. Outside, she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind still on the crescent mark. "Oh, just a sad little room," she said. "But I wonder, did anyone see Eliza last night before it happened?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking, "Well, I heard she was at home all evening. The vicar mentioned seeing a light in her window around 9, but no one saw her after that." "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," Miss Marple said lightly, though her mind was anything but idle. She bid Mrs. Bantry good-bye and began the walk back to her cottage, her thoughts a tangle of possibilities. Eliza's death, the crescent mark, the torn letter, and Mr. Vane's uneasy presence at the garden party all swirled together, forming a pattern she could not yet fully discern. Back at home, she settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched as she stared out the window. The crescent mark reminded her of something from her childhood, a game she and her cousins had played in the village of Little Hampton. They had used chalk mark stars, circles, crescents to signal secret meeting places or hidden treasures. The memory brought a faint smile, but it quickly faded. This was no child's game. The mark on Eliza's doorstep was a signal, she was certain, but for whom and why? She recalled Eliza's nervous demeanor at the garden party, the way her eyes had darted toward Mr. Vane whenever he spoke. There had been fear there, but also something else, resignation perhaps, or defiance. And then there was the letter, its cryptic words echoing in Miss Marple's mind. The sign must stay hidden. Hidden from whom? The police? The village? He was charming, yes, but charm was often a mask. She had seen it before, in men like Mr. Fortescue, who had swindled half the village before his schemes unraveled, or young Tommy Pierce, whose boyish grin hid a penchant for petty theft. Eliza had worked for him, or so the gossip went, and their argument, overheard by the butcher's boys, suggested a falling out. Had Eliza known something Vane wanted, kept secret? She made a cup of tea, her hands moving automatically as she considered her next steps. Might recall some detail, a stranger near the cottage, a sound in the night, but above all, Miss Marple knew she must keep the crescent mark to herself for now. If it was a signal, as she suspected, then its maker might still be watching. Lights flickered in windows, and the distant sound of a dog barking carried on the breeze. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from the wool in her hands. She saw the crescent mark in her mind's eye, its delicate curve a silent accusation. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that small things, a glance, a word, a mark, could unravel the grandest of schemes. She would watch, and she would listen, and she would wait. The truth, like the crescent mark, was hidden, but not for long. Not if Jane Marple had anything to say about it. The days that followed were a blur of village activity, each moment layered with the quiet tension of grief and suspicion. Miss Marple went about her routine, attending church, chatting with neighbors, and tending her garden. She visited the cottage again, this time under the pretense of bringing flowers for the late seamstress. The crescent mark was still there, fainter now, as if someone had tried to scrub it away. She noted the change, her lips pursing slightly, was covering their tracks, but they were not as clever as they thought. She spoke to Mrs. Price, who was still shaken by her discovery. "It was awful, Miss Marple," the baker's wife said, twisting her apron in her hands. "I called out to her, but there was no answer. The door was open, just a crack, and I thought she might be ill. But when I saw her lying there," Mrs. Price shuddered. Her eyes were open, like she'd seen something terrible. "Did you notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Anything out of place, perhaps, or someone nearby?" Mrs. Price frowned, thinking. "Well, there was a man walking down the lane earlier that evening. I saw him from my window, but it was dark, and I couldn't make out his face. He was moving quickly, like he didn't want to be seen. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now—" Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. "A man in the lane, a crescent mark on the doorstep, a woman dead in her own home." The pieces were beginning to fit, though the picture was still incomplete. She thanked Mrs. Price and returned home, her mind turning to the vicar. He was a kind man, observant in his quiet way, and he had mentioned seeing a light in Eliza's window the night she died. Perhaps he had seen more than he realized. The vicarage was a short walk from her cottage, its garden neat and orderly, a reflection of the vicar's methodical nature. He welcomed her warmly, offering tea and biscuits, and listened as she steered the conversation toward Eliza. "It's such a tragedy," he said, shaking his head. "She was a good soul, always willing to help with the church bazaar. I saw her light on that night, around 9. I was walking back from visiting old Mr. Giles." "Did you see anyone else?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "It's such a quiet lane, one notices strangers." The vicar hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Now that you mention it, I did see someone, a man, I think, near the cottage. He was standing by the hedge, but it was too dark to see clearly. I assumed he was just passing through." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained serene. "And did you notice anything else? Anything unusual?" The vicar shook his head. "Not that I can recall, though there was a mark on the ground near Eliza's gate, a little chalk drawing. I thought it was just children playing, but it was an odd place for it. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her teacup. A chalk drawing, you say? What did it look like? Oh, just a little crescent, like a moon. Nothing much to it, really. She smiled, though her mind was racing. The vicar's observation confirmed her suspicion. The crescent mark was no accident. It was a signal, a message meant for someone specific. But who and what did it mean? She left the vicarage with a polite thank you, her thoughts churning. The crescent mark, the stranger in the lane, Eliza's nervous glances at Vane. These were not coincidences. They were threads in a web, and at its center, she suspected, was Mr. Clarence Vane. His charm, his wealth, his secrecy, all pointed to a man with something to hide. And Eliza, poor Eliza, had known too much. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village settle into darkness. The crescent mark haunted her, its simplicity a stark contrast to the complexity of the crime it signified. She thought of the letter again, its torn edges and cryptic words. The sign must stay hidden. Hidden, but not from her. She would find the truth, she resolved, no matter how carefully it was concealed. The next morning brought a fresh wave of gossip. The inquest was scheduled for the following day, and the village was abuzz with speculation. Miss Marple attended the market, listening as the villagers traded theories. Some believed Eliza's death was a tragic accident, a heart weakened by stress or grief. Others whispered of darker possibilities, poison perhaps, or foul play. Miss Marple said little, her eyes sharp behind her gentle smile, but she noted every word, every glance. She stopped by the post office, where Tom, the postman, was sorting letters with his usual efficiency. He greeted her cheerfully, but there was a nervousness in his eyes, a slight tremor in his hands. Miss Marple made a mental note. Tom was young, impressionable, easily swayed by money or promises. Had Vane enlisted him in some way? Was he the stranger in the lane, or perhaps a go-between? She purchased a stamp, chatting idly about the weather, but her mind was elsewhere. The crescent mark was the key. She was certain. It was a signal, a code, a message passed in secret. And secrets, in Miss Marple's experience, were rarely innocent. As she walked home, the village seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the lane, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the inquest. She would attend, of course, and she would watch. The coroner might call it a heart attack, but Miss Marple knew better. Eliza's death was no accident, and the crescent mark was her proof. She reached her cottage and paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the ground. No chalk marks here, no crescents or signals, but the village was full of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them. She stepped inside, her resolve firm, and picked up her knitting. The needles clicked, a steady rhythm, as her mind worked through the puzzle. A death, a mark, a man with too much charm. The truth was close. She could feel it, and she would not rest until it was revealed. Chapter 5. The Inquest. The village hall of St. Mary Mead was a modest building, its whitewashed walls and sturdy oak beams a testament to decades of community gatherings, christenings, weddings, and the occasional somber inquest. Today, it was packed to the brim, the air thick with the mingled scents of polished wood, damp wool from rain-soaked coats, and the faint, nervous sweat of a village grappling with sudden tragedy. The death of Eliza Gray had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead. and the coroner's inquest was the first formal attempt to make sense of it. Villagers sat shoulder to shoulder on creaking benches, their murmurs a low hum like bees before a storm. At the back, tucked into a corner near a drafty window, sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The coroner, Mr. Reginald Pym, was a wiry man with a pinched face and spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose. He stood at a makeshift podium, flanked by a clerk scribbling notes and Dr. Haydock, the village physician, who had examined Eliza's body. The room quieted as Mr. Pym cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles for the third time in as many minutes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice nasal but authoritative, "we are gathered to ascertain the cause of death of Miss Eliza Gray, found deceased in her cottage on the evening of October 12th. This inquest will proceed with evidence from relevant parties, and I ask for your patience and silence." Miss Marple's needles paused briefly as she glanced at the front row, where Mr. Clarence Vane sat, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His face was a mask of solemnity, but Miss Marple noted the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers tightened briefly when Eliza's name was mentioned. She had seen such signs before, small, almost imperceptible tells that betrayed a mind not entirely at ease. Dr. Haydock was called first. He rose, his broad shoulders filling out his tweed jacket, and spoke in the measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering grim news. "I examined Miss Gray at approximately 9 o'clock that evening, after Mrs. Price, her neighbor, raised the alarm. She was found slumped in her armchair, no visible signs of struggle. Based on my examination, I concluded that Miss Gray suffered a cardiac arrest, likely due to a pre-existing heart condition. There were no external injuries, no signs of poisoning, and nothing to suggest foul play." The room stirred, a few villagers exchanging glances. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Dr. Haydock was competent, but she knew his examinations were sometimes cursory, especially in cases that appeared straightforward. A heart attack at Eliza's age barely 30 was unusual, and Miss Marple's mind flickered to the faint crescent mark she had seen on Eliza's doorstep. It was too deliberate, too precise, to be meaningless. Mr. Pym nodded, scribbling a note. "Dr. Haydock, can you confirm the time of death?" "Between 6 and 8 that evening, based on body temperature and rigor," Dr. Haydock replied. "I'd place it closer to 7. "And her medical history?" the coroner pressed. "She had no known heart issues," Dr. Haydock admitted. "But such conditions can remain undetected until they prove fatal. Stress or exertion could have triggered it." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. Stress, she thought, or something else entirely. She recalled Eliza's nervous demeanor at Vane's garden party, the way her hands had trembled when she poured tea during their last conversation. Eliza had been frightened, not merely stressed, and that torn letter, mentioning the sign, must stay hidden. It gnawed at Miss Marple's thoughts like a loose thread in her knitting. Next, Mrs. Price, Eliza's neighbor, took the stand. A stout woman with a penchant for loud hats. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief as she recounted finding Eliza. "I went to check on her, as I often did. She hadn't been herself lately, always looking over her shoulder. When I knocked and got no answer, I used the spare key. There she was, in her chair, pale as a ghost. I called for help, but it was too late. "Did you notice anything unusual in the cottage?" Mr. Pym asked. Mrs. Price hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing out of place, sir." Her sewing was on the table, her tea gone cold. It was all so ordinary. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Ordinary, except for that crescent mark. She had visited the cottage herself the morning after Eliza's death, slipping in before the police had cordoned it off. The mark was faint, drawn in chalk on the stone doorstep, easily missed by someone not looking for it. The police hadn't noticed it, and Mrs. Price, bless her, wasn't the sort to notice subtle details. But Miss Marple had seen it, and it had lodged in her mind like a burr. The inquest continued with testimony from Constable Reed, who had been first on the scene. His report was brief. No signs of forced entry, no theft, nothing to contradict Dr. Haydock's findings. "It seemed a straightforward case, sir," he said, his young face earnest. "We didn't think it needed more than a routine check." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Routine checks, she thought, were the bane of proper investigation. She had known too many cases where the obvious answer hid a darker truth. Her mind drifted to a scandal years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a young man's accidental drowning was revealed to be murder after a single overlooked detail, misplaced but unraveled the killer's alibi. Details mattered, and Miss Marple was determined to find the ones the police had missed. The coroner called Mr. Vane next. He rose smoothly, his charm almost tangible as he addressed the room. "I knew Miss Grey only as an acquaintance," he said, his voice steady. "She worked for me briefly in London as a typist before I moved to St. Mary Mead. I was shocked to hear of her passing. She seemed a kind, if quiet, young woman." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Vane's words were polished, but she caught the slight hesitation before he mentioned Eliza's work for him. She had heard from Mrs. Bantry that Eliza and Vane had argued recently, though the details were vague. An argument, a death, and a mysterious mark, too many coincidences for Miss Marple's liking. "Mr. Vane," Mr. Pym said, "can you confirm your whereabouts on the evening of October 12th? "I was at Willow House, hosting a small dinner for business associates," Vane replied. "We were there from 6 until well past 10. My staff can confirm it." Miss Marple made a mental note to check with Vane's staff herself. Alibis were only as strong as the people who provided them, and she had known many a servant persuaded to stretch the truth for a generous employer. The inquest dragged on, with minor witnesses adding little of substance. The baker's boy had seen Eliza in the village that afternoon, looking a bit peaky. The postman, Tom, mentioned delivering a letter to her cottage that morning, but he hadn't lingered. By the time Mr. Pym delivered his verdict, the room was restless. "Based on the evidence presented," the coroner said, pushing up his spectacles, "I find that Miss Eliza Grey died of natural causes, specifically cardiac arrest. On the evening of October 12th, no further investigation is required." A murmur of relief swept through the crowd, but Miss Marple's needles stilled. Natural causes. The words rang hollow. She glanced at Vane, who was already rising, offering condolences to those nearby with a practiced air of sincerity. "To practiced," she thought, as the villagers filed out into the drizzling rain. Miss Marple lingered, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She approached Dr. Haydock, who was gathering his notes. "Dr. Haydock," she said, her voice gentle but probing, "are you quite certain there was no possibility of poison? I recall a case in Chipping Cleghorn where a heart attack was induced by a subtle toxin. Dr. Haydock frowned, then shook his head. I looked for the usual signs: discoloration, odor, muscle rigidity. There was nothing, Miss Marple. Besides, who would want to harm a seamstress? Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone mild. Who? Indeed. She stepped outside, her mind turning over the details. The crescent mark, Eliza's fear, Vane's connection to her past, it all pointed to something more sinister than a heart attack. She thought of the torn letter again, its cryptic phrase about a hidden sign. In her youth, she had played a game with her cousins, drawing symbols in chalk to mark secret meeting spots. A crescent had been one of them, a signal for all clear. Could it be a coincidence? Miss Marple doubted it. That evening, she sat by her fire, her knitting untouched, as she sipped tea and stared into the flames. Eliza had worked for Vane in London, and Mrs. Bantry had mentioned his trips to the city, where he met with a financier named Holt. Had known something about Vane's business, something dangerous enough to warrant her silence. Then the crescent mark might be a clue to a larger scheme. Blackmail, perhaps, or fraud. Miss Marple had seen both in her time, and they often left a trail of small, overlooked signs. She resolved to visit Eliza's cottage again, to look for anything the police had missed. She also needed to speak to Mrs. Bantry about Vane's London connections, and the crescent marquette's twin near Willow House suggested it was no accident. Someone was signaling someone else, and Miss Marple intended to find out who. The next morning, she walked to the village post office, where Tom was sorting letters. He was a wiry young man, always eager to chat, but today he seemed distracted. "Good morning, Tom," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "You mentioned delivering a letter to Eliza the day she died. Was it anything out of the ordinary?" Tom flushed, his hands fumbling with a stack of envelopes. "Just a letter, Miss Marple. Nothing special. I didn't look at it." "Of course not," she said, her tone soothing. But she noted his eyes darted to the side. Tom knew more than he was saying, and Miss Marple filed that away for later, as she left the post office. She passed Willow House, pausing to glance at the stone gate. The crescent mark was still there, faint but unmistakable. She bent down, pretending to adjust her shoe, and studied it closely. The chalk was fresh, not weathered by rain. Someone had drawn it recently, perhaps even after Eliza's death. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The inquest had closed the case, but she was far from satisfied. Eliza's death was no accident, and the crescent mark was the key. She would need to tread carefully, was clever, and if he was involved, he would be watching for anyone who asked too many questions. But Miss Marple had unraveled mysteries before, and she would do so again. The truth, she knew, was often hidden in the smallest details, and she was determined to find it. Over the next few days, she made discreet inquiries, chatting with villagers under the guise of idle gossip. Mrs. Price mentioned seeing Vane near Eliza's cottage a week before her death, though she hadn't thought much of it at the time. The vicar recalled Eliza attending church less frequently in recent months, as if she were avoiding someone, and Mrs. Bantry, over tea, let slip that Vane's business dealings in London were rumored to be less than savory, involving a man named Holt who had a reputation for shady loans. Each piece of information was a thread, and Miss Marple was weaving them together. The crescent mark, the letter, Vane's past, Eliza's ferret, all pointed to a pattern, one she had seen before in different guises. In her youth, A friend had solved a blackmail case by noticing a series of coded symbols left in public places. The crescent mark felt eerily similar, a signal meant for someone specific. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had a plan. She would need to confirm Vane's alibi, dig deeper into his London connections, and find out who else in the village might be involved. Tom, the postman, was a weak link, she suspected, and she would start with him. But first, she returned to Eliza's cottage. Slipping inside, under the pretense of collecting a shawl Eliza had mended for her. The cottage was dim, the air still heavy with the scent of lavender and dust. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning every surface. The sewing table was as Mrs. Price had described, with a half-finished dress and a spool of thread. But under the table, tucked against the leg, was a small scrap of paper missed by the police. Miss Marple picked it up, her heart quickening. It was another fragment of the torn letter, with the words "meet" at the sign scrawled in Eliza's handwriting. She slipped the paper into her pocket, her mind racing. The crescent mark was a meeting point, a signal for someone to collect or deliver something. But what and who? Vane was the obvious suspect, but he was too careful to act alone. There was an accomplice, someone in the village, and Miss Marple was determined to find them. As she left the cottage, she glanced at the doorstep. The crescent mark was still there, but fainter now, as if someone had tried to scrub it away. She smiled faintly. Whoever was behind this was getting nervous, and nervous people made mistakes. Miss Marple had seen it before, and she would see it again. For now, she would keep her discoveries to herself, letting the village settle into its false sense of closure. The truth, she knew, would come to light in time, and she would be ready when it did. Chapter 6. Village Whispersest. Mary Mead hummed with its usual rhythm of quiet routines and subtle gossip. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, sat by her parlor window, her sharp eyes taking in the village's familiar dance. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor, but her mind was far from the cozy domesticity of her cottage. The death of Eliza Gray, officially deemed a heart attack, gnawed at her. The faint crescent mark on Eliza's doorstep, unnoticed by the police, lingered in her thoughts like a stray thread in a neatly knitted scarf. She set her knitting aside and adjusted her spectacles, her gaze drifting to Willow House, the grand residence now occupied by Mr. Clarence Vane. The man had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a month ago, yet his presence seemed to ripple through the village like a stone dropped in a still pond. His charm was undeniable, polished, deliberate, and just a touch too perfect, like a rehearsed speech. Miss Marple had observed him at the garden party, his smiles wide but his eyes watchful, especially when Eliza Gray had hovered near him, her face pale and her hands fidgeting. Now Eliza was dead, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unraveling human nature's subtler knots, of Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who bustled into Miss Marple's cottage with her usual energy. Her cheeks flushed from the brisk walk across the village green. "Jane, you simply must hear this," she announced, settling into an armchair without ceremony. "The whole village is talking about Mr. Vane's latest trip to London. Apparently, he's been seen with that dreadful Mr. Holtu, the financier with the ghastly reputation. They say he's mixed up in all sorts of shady dealings." Miss Marple poured tea, her movements calm but her mind alert. "Mr. Holt, you say?" I don't believe I've heard much about him. What sort of dealings? Her tone was mild, inviting confidence, as if she were merely indulging her friend's love of gossip. But Mrs. Bantry's words were a thread she could tug, and she intended to see where it led. Oh, the usual sort, Mrs. Bantry said, waving a hand. Dodgy investments, rumors of fraud, that kind of thing. My Arthur heard it from Mr. Pye at the golf club Holt's. Been fleecing people for years, they say. They've been spotted together at that fancy club in London, the one where all the questionable types gather. What's it called? The Regent, I think. Miss Marple nodded, her face serene but her thoughts racing. A financier with a dubious reputation, tied to Vane, who had employed Eliza Gray and argued with her shortly before her death. The crescent mark on Eliza's doorstep, the torn letter mentioning the sign must stay hidden. It was beginning to form a pattern, though the edges were still frayed. How interesting, she murmured. And Mr. Vane's trips to London, they're frequent, are they? Terribly frequent, Mrs. Bantry said, leaning forward. Mrs. Price at the post office says he's always sending telegrams and getting parcels from London. And he's so secretive about it. Never chats with her like the rest of us do. Just pops in, does his business, and off he goes. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving connections. Vane's secrecy, his association with Holt, and Eliza's death were threads in the same tapestry. She recalled a case from years ago, a village scandal involving a blackmail scheme. The culprit had used coded messages, slipped into letters, or left in subtle markings to coordinate with accomplices. Could Vane be running something similar? And had Eliza, perhaps, been a loose end he couldn't afford? The conversation shifted to village matters, Mrs. Bantry's roses, the vicar's latest sermon, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained fixed on Vane. After her friend left, she took a walk through St. Mary Mead, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning the familiar paths. The village was peaceful, its thatched cottages and tidy gardens, a picture of rural charm. But beneath the surface, she sensed a current of unease. At the village shop, she lingered near the counter, where Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was sorting letters. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "I hear Mr. Vane's been keeping you busy with his telegrams." Mrs. Price looked up, her eyes gleaming with the chance to share a tidbit. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. He's in here nearly every other day, sending wires to London or picking up packages. Never says much, mind you." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "And does he ever receive letters from anyone in particular? A business associate, perhaps?" Mrs. Price frowned, thinking, "Well, now you mention it, there've been a few from London, addressed from a Mr. Holt. Thick envelopes, they were, I thought. They might be business papers, but Mr. Vane always whisks them away before I can so much as glance at them." Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her mind turning over this new piece. Holt again. The financier's name was cropping up too often to be coincidence. She made her way to the village green, where children played and a few villagers exchanged pleasantries. Near the war memorial, she spotted Tom, the postman, his bag slung over his shoulder as he made his rounds. Tom was a cheerful sort, always ready with a smile, but today he seemed distracted, his eyes darting toward Willow House as he passed. "Good morning, Tom," Miss Marple called, pausing by the green. "A fine day for your rounds," Tom started, then grinned. "Morning, Miss Marple. Aye, it's a fair day. Just keeping busy, you know." He adjusted his cap, his movements a touch too quick. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the faintest tremor in his hands. "You must see all sorts in the village, delivering letters. I suppose Mr. Vane keeps you busy, too, with all his correspondence." Tom's grin faltered, just for a moment. He tipped his cap and hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his unease. Tom had always been an open book, but today he seemed guarded, as if hiding something. A messenger, perhaps, for whatever scheme Vane was running. As she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the crescent mark. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, yet it felt like the key to unlocking Vane's secrets. She recalled a childhood game in St. Mary Mead, where children would leave chalk marks, circles, stars, crescents to signal secret meeting spots or hidden treasures. But for what? Blackmail, fraud, or something more sinister? Back in her parlor, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her mind far from idle. She thought of Eliza, a quiet young woman who'd worked for Vane in another town before coming to St. Mary Mead. The argument Mrs. Bant had mentioned, overheard by a neighbor, suggested Eliza had known something Vane wanted kept quiet. Had she threatened to expose him? And was Holt, the financier, another piece of the puzzle, or another victim? The afternoon brought a visit from her nephew, Raymond West, who was passing through on his way to London. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, was always amused by his aunt's knack for uncovering village intrigues. "Aunt Jane," he said, sprawling in a chair, "you've got that look again. What's brewing in St. Mary Mead this time?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, nothing much, Raymond. Just a few curious threads I'm trying to untangle. Tell me, have you heard of a Mr. Holt in London? A financier, I believe." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "Holt? I've heard the name. Bit of a shady character, from what I gather. Mixed up in some questionable investments a few years back." "Why do you ask?" "Just something I heard," Miss Marple said vaguely. "And Mr. Vane, our new neighbor, does his name ring any bells?" Raymond shook his head. "Can't say it does. But if he's caught your eye, Aunt Jane, I'd wager he's up to no good. You've a nose for these things." Miss Marple chuckled, but her mind was already elsewhere. Raymond's mention of Holt's questionable investments aligned with Mrs. Bantry's gossip. If Vane and Holt were partners in some scheme, and Eliza had been caught in the middle, her death might not have been a heart attack at all. Poison, perhaps, or something subtler, designed to look natural. The crescent mark suggested a network, a way for Vane to communicate with others without drawing attention. But who else was involved? As evening fell, Miss Marple took another walk, this time toward Willow House. The grand estate stood at the edge of the village, its gardens immaculate, but its windows dark, as if guarding secrets. She paused by the gate, her eyes scanning the stone where she'd seen the crescent mark. It was still there, faint but unmistakable, etched into the weathered surface. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, then knelt to examine it closer. The mark was precise, not the work of a child's game, but something deliberate. A signal meant for someone who knew to look for it. A rustle in the bushes made her straighten, her heart quickening. She turned to see a cat dart across the path, and she smiled at her own jumpiness. But the moment reminded her to be cautious. If Vane was as dangerous as she suspected, he wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who got too close to his secrets. She made a mental note to speak to the vicar, who had a knack for noticing things others missed. Perhaps he'd seen something near Eliza's cottage or near Willow House that could shed light on the Crescent's purpose. Back at home, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled into her routine, her knitting a steady rhythm as her mind worked. The village was full of whispers about Vane, Holt, Eliza, and now Tom, the postman's odd behavior. Each whisper was a clue, a fragment of the larger picture. She thought of a case from her youth when a friend had uncovered a smuggling ring. By noticing a pattern of signals marks on trees, notes hidden in church pews, the crescent mark felt like part of such a pattern, a hidden sign that could fell Vane's plot if she could only decipher its meaning. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where the vicar, Mr. Clement, welcomed her with his usual warmth. Over tea, she steered the conversation toward Vane. "I hear he's been quite the addition to St. Mary Mead," she said. "Have you noticed anything unusual about him?" The vicar hesitated, then leaned forward. "Well, now that you mention it, I did see him near Eliza's cottage the night she died. He was standing by the gate, looking, well, rather furtive. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now, with her passing, it seems odd." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Furtive, you say? How curious. And have you noticed anyone else acting strangely? A stranger in the village, perhaps?" The vicar nodded. "As a matter of fact, yes. A man came to the vicarage a few days ago, asking about footpaths near Willow House. Said he was a hiker, but he didn't look the type. A bit rough around the edges, if you know what I mean." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind racing. A stranger asking about footpaths near the crescent-marked stone suggested an accomplice, someone tied to Vane's scheme. She thanked the vicar and left, her steps light but her thoughts heavy. The pieces were coming together, but the picture was still incomplete. Vane, Holt, Eliza, Tom, the crescent mark, the stranger, each was a thread, and she needed to weave them into a coherent whole. Over the next few days, Miss Marple kept a close eye on the village, her walks taking her past Willow House, the post office, and Eliza's cottage. She noticed Tom lingering near the shop, his eyes darting nervously. She saw Vane leave for London again, his car speeding out of the village with a purpose that felt urgent, and she kept returning to the crescent mark, its simplicity mocking her. It was a sign, she was certain, but of what? A drop-off point for blackmail payments, a signal for a meeting, or something more sinister, like a marker for murder. One afternoon, as she tended her roses, Miss Marple overheard two villagers gossiping about Vane's latest trip. "They say he's got business in London again," one said. "But I heard from Mrs. Price he's been getting letters from all sorts of places, not just London. Bristol, Manchester, even abroad." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. A wider network than Vane's scheme wasn't confined to St. Mary Mead or even London. If he was running a blackmail ring, as she suspected, he could have victims or accomplices. The country, Eliza and Holt, might have been part of that network, either as victims who'd turned against him, or as partners he'd betrayed. The crescent mark was the key, a silent signal that tied it all together. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting idle in her lap. She thought of Eliza, a young woman who'd come to St. Mary Mead seeking a quiet life, only to be caught in Vane's web. She thought of Holt, a man whose greed had likely made him a target, and she thought of Vane, his charm, a mask for something darker. The crescent mark was his mistake, a small thing that had escaped his control. Miss Marple knew from experience that it was often the smallest things, a glance, a word, a mark that brought criminals to justice. She resolved to act soon, to set a trap that would flush out Vane's accomplices and expose his scheme. But she would need to be careful. Vane was clever, and if he suspected she was onto him, he wouldn't hesitate to act. The crescent mark was her advantage, a hidden sign that could fell his plot if she played her cards right. For now, she would watch and listen, letting the village's whispers guide her to the truth, as the fire crackled and the village settled into the quiet of night. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles moving with steady precision. The pattern was taking shape, both in her scarf and in her mind. Vane's secrets were unraveling, thread by thread, and she would be ready when the time came to pull the final one. Chapter 7. The Hidden Sign. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her sitting room, needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a scarf for her nephew, Raymond West. The village of St. Mary Mead was waking slowly, the distant chime of the church clock marking 8 o'clock, and the faint hum of life, Mrs. Price's bicycle bell, the milkman's clinking bottles drifted through the open window. But Miss Marple's mind was far from the tranquil routine of the village. Her thoughts were fixed on the crescent mark she had glimpsed on Eliza Gray's doorstep and the troubling implications it carried. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt with a practiced hand. The air was crisp as she stepped into her garden, where roses and lavender bloomed in neat rows, a testament to her quiet diligence. Her eyes, however, were drawn beyond her own gate to the path that led toward Willow House, the grand residence of Mr. Clarence Vane. The memory of that faint chalk crescent, so easily overlooked, nagged at her. It was no idle doodle, she was certain. It was deliberate, a signal of some kind, and its presence on Eliza's doorstep suggested a connection to her untimely death. Miss Marple adjusted her hat and picked up her gardening basket, deciding that a closer look at Willow House might prove illuminating. She often found that gardening offered a convenient excuse to observe the world without arousing suspicion. With a trowel and a pair of gloves in hand, she set off down the lane, her steps measured but purposeful. The village was quiet, save for the occasional passerby, a young boy on his way to the post office, a farmer's cart rattling toward the market. St. Mary Mead had a way of seeming unchanging. Simmered beneath its placid surface, Willow House loomed at the end of the lane, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys giving it an air of faded grandeur. The iron gate stood slightly ajar, and Miss Marple paused, her sharp eyes scanning the stone pillars that flanked it. There, etched into the base of the left pillar, was another crescent mark, fainter than the one on Eliza's doorstep, but unmistakable. It was carved with care, as if meant to blend into the weathered stone, visible only to those who knew to look. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Schemes. She knelt as if to inspect a weed, her fingers brushing the stone. The mark was shallow, likely made with a pocket knife rather than chalk, suggesting permanence. This was no fleeting signal, but part of something larger, something planned. Had been fresh, easily erased, but this one was older, weathered by rain and time. It suggested Willow House was a hub of whatever scheme Vane was running, and Eliza had been tangled in it, Miss Marple glanced toward the house. The curtains were drawn, and no movement stirred within. Mr. Vane, she knew, was often away in London, his trips shrouded in vague explanations about business. But what kind of business required secret marks on stones and doorsteps? She recalled the torn letter Eliza had dropped during their tea. Its cryptic mention of the sign must stay hidden. The crescent, she suspected, was that cinemarker for someone or something to follow. She returned to her gardening, pulling a few stray weeds to maintain her cover, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The crescent reminded her of a game she had played as a girl in St. Mary Mead, when children would leave chalk symbols on walls or trees to guide treasure hunts or secret meetings. Could Vane's scheme be so brazen as to borrow from childhood games? Or was the simplicity itself the point, a way to communicate without arousing suspicion? As she worked, a figure approached along the lane. Mrs. Bantry, her friend and confidant, out for her morning walk. Mrs. Bantry's cheerful wave belied her knack for gossip, which Miss Marple often found useful. "Good morning, Jane," Mrs. Bantry called, her voice carrying across the quiet lane. "What brings you out so early? Not spying on our mysterious Mr. Vane, I hope?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the faintest hint of mischief. "Just tending to a few weeds, Dolly. Though I must say, Willow House does have a certain intrigue about it." Mrs. Bantry laughed, falling into step beside her. "Oh, don't I know it? Everyone's talking about Vane's latest trip to London, the ghastly mustache. They say he's mixed up in all sorts of shady dealings." Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. "I believe Eliza Gray once worked for a man like that before she came to St. Mary Mead. Did Vane mention anything about their business?" "Not a peep," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "But you know how Vane is charming as anything, but you never quite know what he's thinking. I heard he and Eliza had a dreadful row at the garden party, something about money owed, or so Mrs. Price says." Miss Marple's needles paused in her mind, though her hands remained busy with the trowel. A row over money, a torn letter, a crescent. Mark the pieces were beginning to fit, though the picture remained incomplete. "How curious," she murmured. "I wonder what Eliza knew that made her so nervous around him." Mrs. Bantry shrugged, oblivious to the depth of Miss Marple's musings. "Well, she's gone now, poor thing. Heart attack, they say, though I can't help but think there's more to it. You don't suppose Vane had anything to do with it, do you?" Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alight with possibilities. "People often reveal more than they intend, Dolly. It's the little things, gestures, glances, a mark in the dust that tell the story." Mrs. Bantry chuckled, accustomed to Miss Marple's cryptic remarks. "You and your little things, Jane. If there's a mystery in St. Mary Mead." They parted ways, and Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her basket now full of weeds and her head full of questions. She settled at her writing desk, pulling out a small notebook where she recorded her observations. In neat, precise handwriting, she jotted down crescent mark on willow house pillar, carved, not chalk, same as Eliza's doorstep. Signal for accomplices. Connection to Vane's London trips and Holt, Eliza's letter. The sign must stay hidden. Blackmail. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing. Blackmail fit Vane's polished exterior and secretive habits. Eliza, with her nervous demeanor and past employment with Vane, might have known too much. Perhaps about a fraud or scheme he was running with Holt. The crescent marks could be signals for drop-offs or meetings. But who else was involved? And why had Eliza been silenced? The afternoon passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending to her roses and mulling over her next move. She decided against sharing her discovery with Inspector Craddock just yet. The police, she knew, often overlooked the small details that mattered most, and she had no wish to alert Vane or his accomplices prematurely. Instead, she resolved to watch Willow House more closely, perhaps under the guise of her evening walks. As dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, sky streaked with pink and gold, she strolled toward Willow House, her pace leisurely but her senses alert. The gate was closed now, and no lights burned in the windows. Vane was either away or keeping a low profile. She lingered near the pillar, pretending to adjust her shoe, and examined the crescent mark again. It was unchanged, but a faint scuff in the dirt nearby caught her Aja footprint, too large for her own, and fresh. Her heart quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. Someone had been here recently, perhaps checking the mark or leaving another. She scanned the lane, but it was empty. The footprint suggested Vane had an accomplice in the village, someone who moved freely without arousing suspicion. She thought of Tom, the postman, who delivered letters daily and knew every path in St. Mary Mead. Could he be involved? Or was it someone else, someone less obvious? Miss Marple returned home, her mind buzzing. She lit a fire in the grate and settled into her armchair, her knitting once again in hand. The crescent mark was the key, she was certain, but its full meaning eluded her. She recalled a case from her youth, when a friend had uncovered a smuggling ring by noticing chalk signals on coastal cliffs. The marks had guided boats to safe coves, and the simplicity of the system had been its strength. Vane's scheme, she suspected, relied on a similar principle, discreet, effective, and hidden in plain sight. The next morning, she visited the village shop, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. Mrs. Price, the shopkeeper, was eager to share the latest news. "Did you hear about Mr. Vane?" she said, leaning over the counter. "Off to London again, they say. Left at dawn in that fancy car of his. And there's a stranger about some man asking for directions to the footpaths near Willow House. Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Very odd, Mrs. Price. Did this stranger say why he was here?" "Not a word," Mrs. Price replied. "Just bought a packet of cigarettes and left. Looked nervous, if you ask me, like he didn't want to be seen." Miss Marple purchased a tin of biscuits and left, her thoughts turning to the stranger. An accomplice, perhaps, checking the crescent mark, or delivering a message. The footpaths near Willow House were secluded, perfect for clandestine meetings. She resolved to speak with the vicar, who often walked those paths and might have seen something useful. The vicarage was a short walk away, its garden bright with late summer flowers. The vicar, Mr. Clement, welcomed her warmly, offering tea and a seat by the window. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure," he said. "I suppose you're here about poor Eliza." "The village is still reeling." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. "I was wondering if you'd noticed anything unusual near Willow House lately, perhaps on your walks." The vicar frowned, his brow furrowing. "Now that you mention it, I did see Mr. Vane near Eliza's cottage the night she died. He was standing by the gate, looking, well, agitated." and there was another man, a stranger, asking about the footpaths a few days ago. I thought he was a hiker, but he seemed awfully interested in the lane by Willow House. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her tone remained mild. How interesting. Did you catch his name? No, I'm afraid not, the vicar said. He was gone before I could ask, but he had a city look about him, smart coat, polished shoes, not the sort you'd expect on a country path. Miss Marple thanked him and left, her suspicions deepening. The stranger's interest in the footpaths, combined with Vane's presence near Eliza's cottage, pointed to a coordinated effort. The crescent marks were likely signals for this stranger, or others like him, to collect or deliver something, perhaps payments, as in a blackmail scheme. Eliza, with her knowledge of Vane's past, had been a threat, and her death had been no accident. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. She opened her notebook and added, "Stranger, asking about footpaths. Vane near Eliza's cottage, night of death. Crescent marks, likely signals for blackmail network. Accomplice in village. Tom." She paused, her pen hovering over the page. The pieces were falling into place. But she needed more, something to draw Vane or his accomplice into the open. She decided to set a subtle trap. At the next village meeting, she would mention the crescent mark in passing, hinting that she'd found something curious near Willow House. If Vane or his accomplice took the bait, they might reveal themselves. It was a risk, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that risks, when calculated, could yield answers. The days that followed were quiet, but Miss Marple's routine belied her vigilance. She walked past Willow House each evening, noting any changes to the crescent mark or signs of visitors. She spoke with villagers, collecting fragments of gossip. A delivery boy who'd seen Vane arguing with a man in a dark coat, a farmer who'd noticed lights in Willow House late at night. Each piece strengthened her theory. Vane was running a blackmail ring, using the crescent marks to signal his network, and Eliza had been silenced to protect it. One evening, as she passed Willow House, she saw Tom, the postman, lingering near the gate. His hands were in his pockets, his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple slowed her pace, pretending to admire a rosebush. Tom glanced at the pillar, then hurried away, his steps quick and uneven. Her heart sank. Tom was a good lad, but greed or fear could sway even the best. Had Vane drawn him into the scheme, perhaps with promises of money? She returned home, her mind made up. The village meeting was tomorrow, and she would plant her rumor about the crescent mark. If Tom or Vane reacted, she would know. If not, she would find another way to flush them out. The crescent mark, small and unassuming, was the key to unraveling Vane's plot, and Miss Marple was determined to follow its trail to the truth. As she settled into bed, the village clock struck 10. The night was still, but Miss Marple's thoughts were anything but. She saw the crescent mark in her mind's eye, glowing like a beacon in the dark. It was a small thing, easily missed, but to her, it was as clear as day, a sign that would fell a criminal's plot. If only she could read it fully. The next morning dawned gray and damp, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a tweed suit and her best hat. The village hall was already bustling when she arrived, the air thick with chatter and the scent of tea. She took her usual seat near the back, her eyes scanning the crowd. Vane was absent, likely in London, but Tom was there, fidgeting with his cap. Mrs. Bantry waved from across the room, and the vicar nodded as he passed. The meeting began with the usual Matters Road repairs. The church fete, but Miss Marple waited for her moment. When the discussion turned to village upkeep, she raised her hand. "I couldn't help but notice," she said, her voice gentle but clear, "a curious mark near Willow House, a little crescent carved into the stone. I wonder if anyone else has seen it." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Tom's cap slipped from his hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Mrs. Price gasped, and the vicar looked puzzled. Miss Marple smiled serenely, but her heart raced. The trap was set. Now she would watch and wait. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Tom left early, his face pale, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the door. She stayed until the end, chatting with Mrs. Bantry and deflecting questions about the mark. "Oh, it's probably nothing," she said lightly, "just an old woman's fancy." But it was far from nothing. As she walked home, the rain began to fall, soft and steady. She thought of Eliza, of the crescent mark on her doorstep, of Vane's polished charm and hidden schemes. The truth was close. She could feel it, like a thread waiting to be pulled. The crescent mark was the key, and Miss Marple would not rest until it had revealed its secrets. Chapter 8. The Second Tragedy. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where she sat with her knitting. The village of St. Mary Mead, usually a haven of predictable rhythms, was still reeling from the shock of Eliza Gray's sudden death. The coroner's ruling of a heart attack had quieted most tongues, but not Miss Marple's mind. Her needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to the whirl of her thoughts, which circled around the faint crescent mark she had seen on Eliza's doorstep and, more recently, near Willow House's gate. But a deliberate signal, though, for what or whom, she was not yet sure. The peace of the morning was shattered by the sharp ring of the telephone. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and answered, her voice calm but expectant. It was Mrs. Bantry, her friend from Chipping Cleghorn, whose voice carried a tremor of urgency. "Jane, have you heard? There's been another death, Meister Holt, that financier fellow in London, the one Clarence Vane's been seen with. Poisoned, they say. It's all over the morning papers." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the receiver. "Poisoned, you say? How dreadful. Do tell me more, Dolly." "They found him in his office late last night, some sort of cyanide. The police think he was working late, alone, or so they say. The papers are calling it a business dispute gone wrong, but it's all very hush-hush. You know how these city types are always some scandal brewing. But Jane, isn't it odd? First Eliza, now Holt, both tied to Vane." Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, "Yes, quite odd indeed." "Did the papers mention anything about Vane himself?" "Not much, just that he was a known associate of Holt's. They did business together, something about investments. Though it all sounds rather shady to me, you don't think?" "Well, surely it can't be connected to poor Eliza, can it?" "I'm not so sure, Dolly," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but her mind racing. "Thank you for telling me. I'll have a look at the papers myself." After hanging up, Miss Marple fetched the morning's Times, which had been delivered to her doorstep by young Tom, the postman. "Dead in office, poison suspected." The article was brief, as was typical in the early stages of such cases. but it confirmed Mrs. Bantry's account. Mr. Reginald Holt, aged 42, had been found slumped over his desk in his London office, a glass of whiskey beside him laced with cyanide. The police were investigating, but no arrests had been made. A single line mentioned Clarence Vane as a business partner, though it offered no further details. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting forgotten. 2 deaths, both linked to Vane. Eliza's had been ruled natural, but the crescent mark on her doorstep gnawed at Miss Marple's instincts. She recalled the torn letter Eliza had dropped during their tea, with its cryptic mention of the sign must stay hidden. The crescent mark, she was certain, was that signal for someone or something connected to Vane's affairs. But what was Vane hiding, and why were those who knew him dying? She rose and walked to her window, peering out at the quiet street. St. Mary Mead seemed untouched by the shadow of these events, its cottages basking in the soft July light. Yet Miss Marple knew better than most that darkness could lurk beneath the most placid surfaces. She thought of Vane's polished charm at his garden party, the way his eyes had darted when Elisa approached him, the overheard snippet about old debts, and now Holt, another piece of Vane's puzzle, was gone. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple decided to visit the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the stamps dispensed. She donned her hat and coat, picked up her wicker basket, and set off down the lane. The air was warm, scented with roses and freshly cut grass, but her thoughts were far from the summer idyll. As she walked, she passed Willow House, its high hedges and wrought iron gate, giving it an air of aloof grandeur. She paused, her sharp eyes scanning the stone pillar by the gate where she had spotted the crescent mark 2 days prior. It was still there, faint but unmistakable, etched into the weathered stone like a whisper of intent at the post office. Of tea from the kettle Mrs. Clegg kept on a small stove. Such a shock about poor Eliza, she said, setting her basket on the counter. And now this dreadful business with Mr. Holt in London. I do wonder if Mr. Vane is quite all right with all these tragedies around him. Mrs. Clegg's eyes gleamed with the prospect of gossip. Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful, isn't it? I heard from Tom he delivers to Willow House. You know that Mr. Vane's been in a right state since Eliza's death, snapping at everyone, locking himself in his study, and now Holt. They say he was a bit of a crook, that Holt fellow, always in some dodgy deal. Dodgy, you say? Miss Marple's tone was all innocent curiosity, but her mind was cataloguing every word. Did Tom mention anything specific about Mr. Vane's mood? Well, Mrs. Clegg leaned closer, lowering her voice. Tom said he saw Vane arguing with someone in his garden a few nights back. Couldn't hear much, but it was heated. And don't tell anyone I said this, but Tom found a letter in Vane's post with no address, just a funny little mark on it. Looked like a half-moon, he said. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. A half-moon, how curious. Did Tom keep it? Oh no, he delivered it, as usual. Didn't think much of it till I mentioned it just now. Probably nothing, but with all that's happened. Mrs. Clegg trailed off, shaking her head. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her mind alight with possibilities. A letter with a crescent mark, just like the one on Eliza's doorstep and the stone at Willow House. It was no coincidence. It was a system, a code. Vane was running something clandestine, and Eliza and Holt had been part of it, willingly or not. But what? Blackmail, as she had suspected earlier, or something more sinister? She thanked Mrs. Clegg and stepped back into the sunlight, her basket swinging lightly at her side. As she walked home, she passed the vicarage, where the Reverend Mr. Clemens was tending his roses. She paused to exchange pleasantries, steering the conversation toward Vane. The vicar, a kind but observant man, mentioned seeing Vane near Eliza's cottage the night she died, pacing as if waiting for someone. He seemed agitated, the vicar said, clipping a wilted bloom. I thought perhaps he was concerned for her, but now, with this news about Holt. Miss Marple thanked him and continued on, her thoughts spinning. Vane near Eliza's cottage, a crescent-marked letter, Holt's poisoning. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. She needed more information about Holt's death and Vane's connection to it. A trip to London was out of the question. She was no longer as spry as she once was, but she knew someone who could help back at her cottage. She telephoned her nephew, Raymond West, who was in London working on his latest novel. Raymond, though sometimes dismissive of his aunt's village hobbies, was fond of her and always willing to assist. "Raymond, dear," she said when he answered, "I need a small favor. Could you look into this dreadful business with Mr. Holt's death? The papers here are rather vague, and I'd like to know more about his dealings with a Mr. Clarence Vane." Raymond chuckled. "Aunt Jane, are you sleuthing again? All right, I'll poke around. Holt's name has been in the papers bit of a shady character, from what I hear. I'll see what I can find and ring you back." Satisfied, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, picking up her knitting once more. The needles resumed steady rhythm, but her mind was far from idle. She thought of Eliza, young and nervous, dropping that torn letter. She thought of Holt, dead in his office, a glass of poisoned whiskey beside him. And she thought of Vane, with his charming smile and secretive eyes, at the center of it all. The crescent mark tied them together, a silent signal of a plot she was determined to unravel. By evening, Raymond called back with news. "Aunt Jane, you've got a nose for trouble," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. Holt was deep in some murky financial schemes, fraud, mostly, fleecing investors with fake stock deals. Vane was his partner in at least one of them, a property venture that went bust a few years ago. The police think Holt's death might be tied to an angry investor, but they're also looking at Vane. He was in London the night Holt died, though he claims he was at a theater. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "A theater? How convenient." "A few things," Raymond replied. "Papers scattered everywhere, like someone was looking for something. And, get this, a small chalk mark on the doorframe, shaped like a crescent moon. The police didn't make much of it, thought it was just vandalism." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A crescent moon, you say? How very interesting. Thank you, Raymond, you've been most helpful." As she hung up, the pieces clicked into place with a clarity that sent a shiver down her spine. The crescent mark wasn't just a signal, it was a signature, a way for Vane's network to communicate without words. Eliza had known something, perhaps stumbled upon the mark's meaning, and it had cost her her life. Poison was a coward's weapon, but an effective one, and Vane, with his polished exterior, struck her as just the sort to use it. She rose and paced her small sitting room, her mind racing. The crescent mark was the key, but she needed to know more about Vane's movements and his accomplices. The stranger the vicar had mentioned, asking about footpaths, was likely one of them. And Tom, the postman, delivering those marked letters, could he be involved, knowingly or not? She needed to act carefully, to draw the culprit into the open without revealing her hand. The next morning, her suspicions about the crescent's significance. She spent the afternoon poring over it, her finger tracing diagrams of secret signs used by smugglers, spies, and thieves through the ages. The crescent, she learned, had been used in various forms as a marker for safe houses or drop points. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but unmistakable to those who knew its meaning. She thought of her childhood in St. Mary Mead, when she and her friends had played games with secret signs. How innocent it had seemed then, and how deadly it was now as evening fell. She walked to the churchyard, where the quiet graves offered a place to think. She passed Eliza's fresh headstone, its simplicity a stark contrast to the mystery surrounding her death. Miss Marple paused, her eyes lingering on the stone. "Poor girl," she murmured. "You saw something you shouldn't have, didn't you?" Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. It was Tom, the postman, carrying a sack of letters. He started when he saw her, his face pale in the twilight. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice unsteady. "Just taking a walk, Tom," she replied, her tone gentle but her eyes sharp. "You've been so busy lately, with all those letters to Willow House. Must be quite a task, delivering for Mr. Vane." "Of course," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Though I did hear about a curious letter with a half-moon mark. Such an odd thing, don't you think?" Tom's eyes widened, and he stammered, I don't know anything about that, Miss. Just deliver what I'm given." He hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to watch his retreating figure. She had struck a nerve, she was sure of it. Tom was involved, perhaps not as a mastermind, but as a cog in Vane's machine back at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap but untouched. The crescent mark was everywhere, on Eliza's doorstep, at Willow House, in Holt's office, on Vane's letters. It was the thread that tied the deaths together, and Vane was at its center. But she needed proof, something solid, to take to Inspector Craddock, who, while competent, often needed a nudge to see what was right under his nose. She decided to set a trap. The next day she visited Mrs. Bantry again, dropping a carefully worded hint that she had found a curious mark near Willow House and planned to report it to the police. If Vane or his accomplice was watching, they would act, and Miss Marple would be ready. As the day wore on, she kept a close eye on Willow House from her window, her binoculars discreetly at hand. She saw Vane leave in his sleek black car, his face set in a grim line. Later, she spotted Tom lingering near the gate, glancing nervously around before bending to examine the stone pillar. Her heart quickened. He was checking the crescent mark, perhaps to erase it. She needed to act quickly, but carefully. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice calm but urgent. "Inspector, I believe you should keep an eye on Willow House. Tonight, there may be some activity near the gates, something to do with a mark on the stone. I'd rather not say more just yet, but I think it's important. A constable to watch discreetly." Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from the wool in her hands. The second tragedy had confirmed her suspicions, but it had also raised the stakes. Vane was dangerous. and the crescent mark was the key to his downfall. She only hoped her trap would spring before another life was lost. The night passed quietly, but the next morning brought news. The constable had seen Tom at the gate, attempting to scrub the crescent mark with a cloth. Under questioning, he admitted to delivering letters for Vane, some marked with crescents, though he swore he didn't know their purpose. Bad. Miss Marple, when informed by Craddock, nodded thoughtfully. "Poor Tom," she said. "He's been used, I'm afraid. But he's given us a start, Inspector. Those letters are the key. I suggest you look closely at Mr. Vane's correspondence and keep an eye on that gate." As Craddock left to follow up, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind already racing ahead. The crescent mark had led her this far, but there was more to uncover. Vane's scheme was unraveling, but he was still free, and dangerous men, when cornered, could be unpredictable. She would need to be careful, but she was determined. The hidden sign had felled one criminal's plot in her youth, and it would do so again. The village settled into an uneasy calm, but Miss Marple knew it was only the calm before the storm. She thought of Eliza, of Holt, of the crescent marks. That linked them. And she thought of Vane, with his charming smile and guilty secrets. The truth was close. She could feel it, as surely as she felt the wool slipping through her fingers. All it would take was one more push, one more carefully placed word, to bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. Chapter 9. The Vicar's Insights. The morning sun cast a soft glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the ancient yews that guarded the village church. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a light shawl, walked briskly along the cobblestone path toward the vicarage, her sensible shoes tapping a steady rhythm. Her mind, sharp as ever, churned over the puzzle of Eliza Gray's death, the crescent mark on her doorstep, and the shadowy figure of Clarence Vane. The village, though outwardly serene, seemed to hum with an undercurrent of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them. She approached the vicarage, a modest stone building nestled beside the church, its garden bursting with late summer roses. The vicar, Mr. Leonard Clement, was a kind-hearted man of middle age, known for his gentle sermons and a tendency to lose himself in theological debates. Miss Marple valued his keen observation, though he often underestimated his own knack for noticing the small details of village life. Today, she hoped his memory might hold a piece of the puzzle. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called the vicar, emerging from the vicarage with a pair of pruning shears in hand. His round face broke into a warm smile as he waved her toward the garden gate. "You're out early. Come to inspect my roses, or is there another mystery afoot?" Miss Marple returned his smile, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "The roses are lovely, Leonard, but I'm afraid my visit is less about horticulture and more about human nature. Might we have a chat?" The vicar's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded, setting the shears on a stone bench. "Of course, let's go inside. Griselda's out visiting, so we'll have the place to ourselves." They settled in the cozy parlor, where a tray of tea and biscuits awaited, courtesy of the vicar's young housekeeper, Mary. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, with sunlight streaming through a leaded window. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the delicate handle as she considered how to broach her questions without alarming the vicar. "I've been thinking about poor Eliza Gray," she began, her tone gentle but deliberate. "Such a tragedy, and so sudden." "You knew her," of course, from her work with the church sewing circle. The vicar nodded, his expression sobering. Yes, poor girl. She was quiet but diligent, always brought her needlework to the meetings, though she seemed distracted lately. I assumed it was the strain of her work. She mentioned taking on extra mending to make ends meet. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloguing this detail. Distracted, you say? Did she ever mention anything troubling her? Perhaps something about her former employer, Mr. Vane? The vicar frowned, his fingers tapping the arm of his chair. Vane? Not directly, no. But now that you mention it, I did see something odd the night she died. I haven't thought much of it until now. It seemed so trivial at the time. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting needles still in her lap. Trivial details often hold the key, Leonard. What did you see? The vicar hesitated, as if piecing together the memory. It was after evening prayers, about 8 o'clock. I was locking up the church when I saw Mr. Vane walking near Eliza's cottage. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, mind you, just strolling along the lane. But it struck me as odd because he rarely walks that way. Most evenings, he's either at Willow House or off to London. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. Near Eliza's cottage, you say? Did he stop or speak to anyone? Not that I saw, the vicar replied. He seemed in a hurry, actually glancing over his shoulder as if he didn't want to be noticed. I thought perhaps he was avoiding someone, Mrs. Price, maybe, with her endless questions about the flower rhoda. He chuckled, then sobered. But now, with Eliza's death, do you think it's significant? It might be, Miss Marple said carefully. One never knows until all the pieces are in place. Did you notice anything else that night? Any strangers about, perhaps? The vicar's face lit up with a sudden recollection. Now that you mention it, yes, there was a man I didn't recognize, a rough-looking fellow, not from the village. He stopped me near the church gate earlier that day, asking about the footpaths around Willow House. Said he was a rambler, but he didn't look the sort. No knapsack, no proper walking boots, just a dark coat and a hat pulled low. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Footpaths near Willow House. That's interesting. Did he ask about anything specific? He wanted to know the quickest way to the old stile by the meadow, the one near the stone wall. I pointed him toward the path that runs past Vane's gate. He thanked me and left, but I got the sense he was more interested in the house than the scenery. Miss Marple's mind raced. The stone wall near Willow House's gate was where she had spotted the crescent mark, etched faintly into a rock. Could this stranger be connected to Vane's scheme? Was he an accomplice, scouting the area for the cryptic signals Eliza's letter had hinted at? She kept her tone light, not wanting to alarm the vicar. How curious. Did you see him again? No, not since, the vicar said, shaking his head. I mentioned it to Griselda, but she thought I was being fanciful. You know how she is, says I read too many detective novels. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Griselda has a point, but sometimes a touch of imagination helps us see what's right in front of us. Tell me, Leonard, have you noticed any other oddities around the village lately? Anything that felt out of place? The vicar leaned back, his eyes drifting to the window as he thought. Well, there's been the usual gossip. Mrs. Bantry's convinced Vane's up to no good, and young Tom the postman's been acting jumpy, dropping letters all over the place, but nothing concrete. Oh, except He paused, his brow furrowing. "There was something odd at the church last week. I found a scrap of paper tucked behind the hymnals with a queer little drawing on it, a sort of half-moon shape." Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "A half-moon, like a crescent, exactly," the vicar exclaimed. "I thought it was just a child's scribble, but it was done in chalk, not pencil. I meant to throw it out, but I forgot. It's probably still there." "May I see it?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but urgent. The vicar led her to the church, a short walk across the garden. The ancient building smelled of polished wood and candle wax, its stained glass windows casting jewel-toned patterns on the pews. He rummaged behind the hymnals in the vestry and produced a crumpled scrap of paper. Sure enough, a faint chalk crescent marked its surface, identical to the one on Eliza's doorstep and the stone near Willow House. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the paper, her mind worry. "This is most helpful, Leonard. May I keep it for now?" "Of course," he said, looking puzzled. "But what does it mean?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," she replied, tucking the paper into her handbag. "But I suspect it's a sign of something rather unpleasant. Thank you, Leonard. You've been invaluable." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tangle of clues. The vicar's sighting of Vane near Elisa's cottage the night she died was troubling, but the stranger asking about footpaths and the crescent mark in the church pointed to a larger scheme. Vane, she suspected, was not acting alone. The crescent marks were signals, as she'd guessed, but for whom? And why had Eliza, and now Holt, paid with their lives? She decided to take a detour past Willow House on her way home. The grand estate loomed at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls and tall chimneys imposing yet elegant. As she approached the gate, she glanced at the stone where she'd seen the crescent mark. It was still there, faintly visible in the morning light. She crouched, pretending to adjust her shoe, and studied the surrounding ground. A faint scuff in the dirt suggested recent foot traffic, not unusual for a public path, but worth noting. As she straightened, a shadow moved behind the gate. Miss Marple's heart skipped, but she kept her composure, turning slowly to see Tom, the postman, hurrying away, his bag slung over his shoulder. He hadn't noticed her, but his haste was telling. She recalled the vicar's mention of Tom's jumpiness. Could he be involved? A postman, after all, was perfectly placed to deliver messages or signals without arousing suspicion. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched as she reviewed her findings. The crescent marks linked Eliza, Holt, and Vane, but the stranger and Tom added new layers. She suspected Vane was running a blackmail ring, as she'd theorized, with the crescent marks signaling drop-offs or meetings. Eliza and Holt, former associates, had likely threatened to expose him, leading to their deaths. But the stranger's presence suggested an outside accomplice, someone Vane relied on to maintain his network. She opened her notebook, a small, leather-bound volume where she jotted down her thoughts. In neat script, for blackmail payments, Vane near Eliza's cottage night of death, stranger asking about footpaths near Willow House, Tom acting oddly, church paper, another signal. She paused, watched Tom closely. The afternoon passed quietly, with Miss Marple tending her garden and exchanging pleasantries with neighbors. But her mind never rested. She recalled a conversation with her nephew, Raymond West, about coded messages in criminal networks. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, had once described how smugglers used symbols to mark safe routes. The crescent, she mused, was simple yet effective, easy to overlook unless you knew its significance. By evening, she decided to consult Mrs. Bantry again. Her friend's gossip, though often exaggerated, was a goldmine of village happenings. Miss Marple donned her hat and set off for Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a tray of scones and a torrent of news. "Jane, you'll never guess what I heard," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, pouring tea. "That vain fellow's been seen with a man in a dark coat, someone from London, they say. Mrs. Price swears she saw them arguing near the post office, and Tom was there, looking like he'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. A man in a dark coat. Did Mrs. Price describe him? Tall, rough-looking, with a hat pulled low, Mrs. Bantry said, waving a scone for emphasis. "She thought he was a debt collector, but I'm not so sure. Vane's up to something, mark my words." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions aligning. The stranger matched the vicar's description, and Tom's presence at the scene was no coincidence. She steered the conversation to lighter topics, not wanting to fuel Mrs. Bantry's imagination too far, but her mind was already planning her next move. That night she sat by her fire, the scrap of paper with the crescent mark on her table. She traced its curve with a finger, thinking of Eliza's torn letter and the words, "The sign must stay hidden." The sign, she was certain, was the key to Vane's downfall, but she needed proof, something to tie the marks to his crimes. Beyond mere suspicion, the next morning, Miss Marple visited the post office, ostensibly to mail a letter to Raymond. Tom was behind the counter, his usual cheer replaced by a nervous fidgeting. "Good morning, Tom," she said brightly. "You seem a bit out of sorts. Everything all right?" Tom flushed, nearly dropping a stack of envelopes. "Oh, fine, Miss Marple, just busy, you know." She smiled, her eyes keen. "Of course, you must see all sorts of letters come through. Any interesting ones lately?" His hands stilled, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. "No, nothing special," he stammered. "Just the usual." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her suspicions confirmed. Tom was hiding something, and she would wager it involved those crescent-marked messages. She resolved to keep a closer eye on him, perhaps with Raymond's help when he arrived. Her nephew, though prone to underestimating her, was useful for tasks requiring a younger pair of eyes. Over the next few days, Miss Marple pieced together more fragments. She learned from the butcher that Vane had ordered an unusual amount of meat delivered to Willow House, suggesting he was hosting someone. The baker mentioned a stranger buying bread daily, always paying in cash and avoiding conversation. Each detail, small on its own, built a picture of a man operating a clandestine network, with the stranger as his link to the outside world. She revisited the church, hoping to find more clues. The vicar was absent, but she examined the hymnals again, finding no further marks. As she left, she noticed a faint chalk smudge on the church gatepost, not a crescent, but a hasty line, as if someone had started to draw and stopped. It was fresh, no older than a day. Her heart quickened. The signals were still active, which meant Vane's scheme was ongoing. Back home, she wrote to Inspector Craddock, outlining her findings in vague terms. She didn't mention the crescent marks directly, wary of exposing her hand too soon, but hinted at suspicious activity near Willow House. Craddock, though skeptical of her hunches, trusted her enough to investigate. She hoped he'd spot the stranger or catch Tom in the act. As the week drew to a close, Miss Marple felt the net tightening. The vicar's insight had been the spark she needed, illuminating Vane's movements and the stranger's role. The crescent marks, she was certain, were the thread that would unravel the entire plot. But she needed one final piece, something to force Vane's hand. An idea began to form, risky but necessary. She would plant a rumor with Craddock's help and watch the ripples spread. She sat by her window, knitting at last, the needles clicking in time with her thoughts. The village slept, unaware of the danger in its midst. But Miss Marple was wide awake, her mind as sharp as the crescent moon rising over St. Mary Mead. The sign, once hidden, was now her weapon, and she would wield it with the quiet precision of a village spinster who saw more than anyone suspected. Chapter 10. A trap set. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the polished oak table where she sat, her knitting needles clicking softly. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quiet outside, its usual hum of gossip subdued by the weight of recent events. Eliza Gray's sudden death ruled a heart attack, and the troubling news of Mr. Holt's poisoning in London. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, though fixed on the pale blue wool in her hands, were far from idle. Her mind turned over the crescent mark she'd found, first on Eliza's doorstep and then near Willow House's gate, a subtle signal that had begun to unravel the threads of Mr. Clarence Vane's carefully woven scheme. She sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm against her fingers, and considered her next move. The crescent mark, she was certain, was no accident. It was a sign, a secret code used by Vane and his associates, perhaps to coordinate their illicit activities. Eliza's torn letter, mentioning the sign must stay hidden, had been the first clue, and the mark near Willow House confirmed it. But to prove Vane's guilt and to uncover any accomplices, she needed to act with precision. The village was a small stage, and its players, however cunning, were prone to slip under pressure. Miss Marple knew this well, from years of observing human nature, from the pettiest squabbles to the darkest crimes. Her plan was simple but bold. She would set a trap by letting it be known that she had noticed a curious mark and intended to report it to the authorities. She hoped to provoke a reaction. The guilty, she had long observed, often betrayed themselves when they felt cornered. But she needed an ally, someone with enough authority to lend weight to her scheme without dismissing her as a meddlesome old spinster. Inspector Craddock, though young and occasionally skeptical of her methods, was the obvious choice. He had a sharp mind, and despite his initial reluctance, he respected her insight. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. She glanced at the clock, 9:30. The inspector was due to arrive soon, having agreed to a meeting after her cryptic note about new evidence. She had been careful not to reveal too much, knowing that even well-meaning police could muddy the waters of a delicate investigation. As she prepared a fresh pot of tea, the doorbell chimed, its gentle ring echoing through the cottage. Inspector Craddock stood at the threshold, his hat in hand, his expression a mix of curiosity and mild exasperation. "Miss Marple," he greeted, stepping inside. "Your note was rather vague, but I'm here. What's this about new evidence?" She smiled, gesturing to a chair. "Do sit down, Inspector T. Lay. I've just brewed a pot." Her tone was light, but her eyes held a glint of purpose. Craddock sat, his broad frame slightly awkward in the delicate chair. "I'll take a cup, thank you. But let's get to it. What have you found?" Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements unhurried. "It's not so much what I've found, Inspector, as what I've noticed. A small thing, really, but small things often matter most. Have you ever played games as a child where a mark or signal was used to pass secrets?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "I suppose so. But what does that have to do with Eliza Gray or Mr. Holt?" "Patience, Inspector," she said, handing him a cup. "I've noticed a marca crescent quite faint in Eliza's doorstep, and again near Mr. Vane's property. It's not the sort of thing one stumbles upon by chance, I believe. It's a signal, part of a system used by Mr. Vane and perhaps others. Eliza's death and Mr. Holt's may be tied to it." Craddock set his cup down, leaning forward. "A mark that's thin, Miss Marple. The coroner ruled Eliza's death natural, and Holt's case is with the London police. You're suggesting a conspiracy based on a chalk mark." "Not chalk alone," she corrected gently. "There was a letter, torn, that Eliza dropped when she visited me. It mentioned the sign must stay hidden, and the crescent near Willow House matches the one at her cottage. I believe Mr. Vane is involved in something unsavory blackmail, perhaps, and these marks are how his network communicates." Craddock rubbed his chin, his skepticism softening. "You've got a knack for seeing things others miss. I'll give you that. But we need more than marks to act on. Vane's a respected man, at least on the surface. If we accuse him without proof, he'll slip through. Which is why," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "we must lay a trap. If I let it be known that I've seen this mark and plan to report it, the guilty party or their accomplice may try to cover their tracks. People under pressure make mistakes." Inspector Craddock hesitated, then nodded. "All right, what's your plan?" Miss Marple outlined her idea with precision. She would visit Mrs. Bantry, the village's most reliable gossip, and casually mention her discovery of a curious mark near Willow House. She would hint that she intended to inform the police, ensuring the news spread quickly through St. Mary Mead's eager tongues. Craddock, meanwhile, would station a discreet officer to watch the gate at Willow House, where the crescent mark lay etched in stone. If someone tried to tamper with it, they'd have their suspect. "It's risky," Craddock said, sipping his tea. "If Vane's as dangerous as you think, he might not take kindly to being cornered." "Which is why we must be subtle," Miss Marple replied. "I shall be careful, and you, Inspector, must ensure your man is unobtrusive. A young constable, perhaps, posing as a gardener. The village is used to such sights." Craddock chuckled. "Despite himself, you've thought this through." "All right, I'll arrange it. But if this goes wrong, Miss Marple, it's on both of us." "Agreed," she said, her smile serene but resolute. "Now I must call on Mrs. Bantry. Timing is everything." The walk to Mrs. Bantry's house was pleasant, the late summer air warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming roses. St. Mary Mead's lanes were quiet, save for the occasional bicycle or the distant bark of a dog. Miss Marple, her straw hat tilted against the sun, carried a small basket of apples as a pretext for her visit. Mrs. Bantry, a widow with a penchant for gardening and gossip, was the perfect conduit for her plan. The woman's enthusiasm for news, however trivial, was unmatched, and Miss Marple knew a single hint would ripple through the village by evening. Mrs. Bantry greeted her at the door, her face lighting up. "Jane, what a treat! Come in, come in. Are those your apples?" look splendid. They're from the old tree in my garden, Miss Marple said, handing over the basket. I thought you might like them for a pie. You're too kind, Mrs. Bantry said, ushering her into the drawing room. Now, tell me what's the latest in St. Mary Mead. I've heard nothing but talk of poor Eliza and that dreadful business in London. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her expression one of mild concern. It's troubling, isn't it? Such sudden deaths. I've been thinking about Eliza, and something curious caught my eye the other day. A mark, quite odd, near Mr. Vane's gate at Willow House, a crescent etched in stone. I couldn't help but wonder if it meant something. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her teacup pausing mid-air. A mark near Vane's place. Oh, Jane, you don't think it's connected, do you? I'm not sure, Miss Marple said, her tone deliberately vague, but it struck me as peculiar. I've half a mind to mention it to Inspector Craddock. He's been so thorough about poor Eliza's case. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You think it's suspicious? Vane's always seemed a bit too polished, if you ask me. And those trips to London, nobody knows what he's up to. Perhaps it's nothing, Miss Marple said, folding her hands. But I do think the police should know. One never can tell with these things. By the time Miss Marple left, Mrs. Bantry was already planning her afternoon calls. The news of the curious mark would spread like wildfire, just as Miss Marple intended. She walked home, slowly, her mind alert to every detail, the flutter of a curtain, the glance of a passer-by. The trap was set, and now she must wait. That evening, the village was abuzz. Miss Marple, sitting by her window, heard snatches of conversation from neighbors passing by. A mark at Willow House, one said. Miss Marple's telling the police, whispered another. She smiled faintly, her knitting needles steady. The bait had been taken, and now it was a matter of watching the shadows. Inspector Craddock had stationed Constable Harris, a young man with a knack for blending in, near Willow House. Disguised as a gardener, he trimmed hedges and kept an eye on the gate, his notebook tucked inside his jacket. Miss Marple, meanwhile, enlisted her nephew, Raymond West, who had arrived unexpectedly for a visit. Raymond, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, was delighted to play a role in his aunt's scheme. Aunt Jane, he said, lounging in her sitting room, you're positively Machiavellian. A crescent mark. It's like something out of one of my novels. Nonsense, Raymond, she replied, though her eyes twinkled. It's merely observation, but I'd be grateful if you'd take a stroll near Willow House tonight. Keep an eye out for anyone lingering near the gate. Discreetly, mind you, Raymond grinned. Discreet's my middle name. I'll report back before midnight. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a pretext for her racing thoughts. The crescent mark was the key. She was sure of it. It tied Vane to Eliza, and likely to Holt through a network of signals and secrets. But who else was involved? The stranger, the vicar, had mentioned, asking about footpaths, was a possibility, or perhaps someone closer, a villager under Vane's sway. Tom, the postman, had been acting oddly lately, his usual cheer replaced by nervous glances. She made a mental note to watch him. The clock struck 10 when Raymond returned, his face flushed with excitement. Aunt Jane, you're a genius. I saw someone at the gate. Tom, the postman, of all people. He was poking around the stone, looking like he'd seen a ghost. I stayed out of sight, but he was definitely up to something. Miss Marple's needles paused. Tom, you say? Interesting. Did he touch the mark? Couldn't tell, Raymond said. It was dark, and he had a torch, but he was focused on that stone. I'd wager he was trying to erase it. Thank you, Raymond, she said, her mind already turning. You've done splendidly. Now we must tell Inspector Craddock. If Tom's involved, he may lead us straight to Vane. The next morning, Miss Marple met Craddock at the police station, a small building on the edge of the village. Constable Harris was there, his face eager as he reported. I saw him, Sir Tom, the postman, around 10:30. He was at the gate, scraping at the stone. I didn't approach, as you said, but I've got a clear view of him in my notes. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Your trap worked, but what's Tom's role in this? He's no mastermind. A messenger, perhaps, Miss Marple said. Someone Vane trusts to carry out small tasks. The crescent marks may signal where messages or payments are left. Tom's not the sort to plan a murder, but he might know more than he realizes. Craddock nodded. I'll bring him in for questioning. If he's scared, he might talk. Be gentle, Inspector, Miss Marple advised. He's likely a pawn, not a king. If you press too hard, he'll clam up. Offer him protection, perhaps. He'll be more afraid of Vane than of you. By midday, Tom was at the station, his face pale and his hands trembling. Miss Marple, allowed to observe from a corner, watched as Craddock questioned him. Tom's story came out in fits and starts. Vane had paid him to deliver letters, some marked with a crescent, to specific spots around the village. He swore he didn't know what was in them, only that Vane was insistent they be handled discreetly. I didn't mean no harm, Tom stammered. It was just extra money. But after Eliza died, I got nervous. Then I heard Miss Marple talking about a mark, and I thought I'd better get rid of it. Craddock leaned forward. Did Vane tell you to erase it? Tom shook his head. No, but he said if anyone asked about the marks, I was to keep quiet. I panicked when I heard Miss Marple knew. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. The trap had snared its first catch, but Vane was the true prize. Tom's confession confirmed the crescent's role as a signal, but it wasn't enough to prove murder. She needed Vane to betray himself, and for that she would need one final push. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple refined her plan. The village was now alive with whispers about the mark, and Vane, she noted, had grown visibly tense. He avoided the pub, kept his curtains drawn, and snapped at a neighbor who asked about his garden party. His polished charm was fraying, just as she'd hoped. She decided to escalate the pressure. With Craddock's approval, she organized a village meeting at the church hall, ostensibly to discuss recent events. She asked Mrs. Bantry to spread the word, ensuring Vane would hear of it. The bait was simple. She would hint that she knew the killer's identity, forcing Vane to act. The evening of the meeting arrived. The hall packed with curious villagers. Miss Marple, dressed in her usual tweed, stood at the front, her voice calm but commanding. My friends, she began, St. Mary Mead has seen too much tragedy of late. Eliza Gray and Mr. Holt are gone, and I believe their deaths are not as they seem. I've found a sine crescent mark that points to a darker truth. I intend to share this with the authorities tomorrow. The room buzzed with murmurs. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the crowd, settling on Vane, who sat near the back, his face pale. His hands gripped the edge of his chair, and she knew the trap was closing. As the meeting ended, Vane lingered, his eyes darting to Tom, who sat across the room, avoiding his gaze. Miss Marple watched, her heart steady. The next move was Vane's, and she was ready. The trap had been set with care, and now the village held its breath. Miss Marple returned home, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. Tom's confession had given her the thread she needed, and Vane's reaction at the meeting confirmed his guilt. The crescent mark, that small, hidden sign, was the key to his undoing. She only hoped Craddock and Raymond were ready for what came next. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Miss Marple sat by her window, the village dark and still. Somewhere out there, Vane was plotting his next move, unaware that an elderly spinster, with her quiet wisdom and keen eye, was one step ahead.